So last year in 2021, towards the beginning around February, I decided that I was going to try my best to watch 2 movies a week that whole year that I'd never seen before. And it was mostly just kind of an exercise to expand my library of movies that I've seen and to sort of do my best to see movies that I knew were classics, or maybe find some movies that were lesser known, some like indie titles. And in the process, I've decided to make a video going over each of those movies, and I ended up watching exactly 100 of them. And of course, these movies are pretty varied. A lot of them are different from each other. There's a lot of big budget blockbusters in there. There's a lot of movies that have come out this past year in 2021 that I watched. And then there are also some movies that are older, some lesser known indie films. It's a large variety. And I just kind of wanted to make this video to go over each of them, give my thoughts on them, give my opinions, and just kind of put it all out there for you guys to watch and hopefully enjoy in some kind of way. So the way this video is going to work is it's going to go from my best movies that I saw to the worst movies that I saw in 2021. And how it's formatted is it's going to go from the movies that I gave a 10 out of 10, and then into the movies that I gave a 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10, and then so on and so forth until it gets to the bottom. I also throw in a couple of TV shows that I watched in there and give my thoughts on those as well. This video is pretty long, and on each movie I do my best to touch on them in some kind of detail, so hopefully that this is something that you guys enjoy, like I said, and this is going to be a kind of different video from the podcast that we put up, and hopefully I'll be able to do something like this again next year, and maybe even put out a couple more videos this year kind of in the same style. So let me know what you think of this video, and hope you enjoy. The Hunt, directed by Thomas Vinterberg, or however it's pronounced, came out 2012, starring Mads Mikkelsen. This was one of the best movies that I watched this year, and it's probably my new favorite foreign film. Probably one of my favorite movies overall that I've watched. Basically, Mads Mikkelsen plays a kindergarten teacher who is falsely accused of doing inappropriate things with one of his students. The whole movie is a very intimate tale about isolation and the effects that a small lie has on one individual to potentially ruin his life. The performance in this movie is great. I think Mads Mikkelsen is perfect for this movie. It's just a very heartbreaking experience to sit through and watch. You get the sense that he's really an innocent guy who's trying to rebuild his life after going through a divorce and going through the tragedy of all that, and to just have this happen to him is a very powerful thing to witness. I like the way that this movie is shot. It kind of has an almost documentary style feel to it, but at the same time it's very stylistic, it's very cinematic in a lot of ways, especially during a scene involving a church. That is my favorite in the movie, without going into spoilers. It tells the story in a way that is respectful to the subject matter, while also viewing it from a new lens and viewing it from the side of what if this guy is innocent, and he is innocent in this movie. And that's sort of the heartbreaking thing about going through and watching this, is that that he didn't do anything, but at the same time you have to watch him go through all this pain of everyone in this small town thinking that he did something terrible. Can't recommend this movie enough. If you get the chance to check it out, please do so. Next up is Nocturnal Animals, directed by Tom Ford, starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Amy Adams. I thought this movie was excellent. This was one of the first movies that I watched this year. Cinematically, I think this movie's brilliant. I think it looks beautiful. And it tells the story of a woman who is a wealthy art dealer who you can tell just doesn't really enjoy her life like she would like to. She's in a loveless marriage. She never sees her daughter anymore. The day-to-day just kind of seems overbearing and kind of gratuitous for her. And then one day she gets this manuscript in the mail from her ex-husband. And as she starts reading through it, you get to see the story of that manuscript play out. And the main character in that manuscript is played by Jake Gyllenhaal, who also plays her ex-husband in the real world. And so throughout the movie, you get a view of both of these stories going on at the same time. You know, you've got Amy Adams' character going through the process of reading the manuscript and how it affects her real life, and she is forced to like look back on the events that happened and the regrets that she has and the mistakes that she's made, while also you get to watch the manuscript story play out. And that story in itself is a tragic story and kind of represents what she put him through in the real world. This is another story that has a tragic tinge to it, that is carried very much by the performances in it, and I think this is a great Jake Gyllenhaal movie. I think that Amy Adams kills it in it also. And again, I think the directing, the cinematography, I think is brilliant. And I think if you are able to watch this, check it out. I believe it's still on Netflix, but I'm not sure if it still will be at the time of this video. I'm Thinking of Ending Things was directed and written by Charlie Kaufman, who I think is one of the best writers in Hollywood in the last 20 years. This movie is about a young woman who's in a relationship where she has doubts and second guesses about whether or not she wants to stay in the relationship. And in the movie, she's going to meet his parents at their farmhouse for the very first time. And this movie is a very surreal experience. It's not afraid to touch on a lot of subject matters at once, but the overall arching theme is sort of regret about one's life choices and looking back on whether or not you could have done things differently if your life had turned out better because of it. The fun in this movie is just trying to figure out what it's about and the overall themes that are going on throughout. And like I said before, there are a lot of themes going on, but it's very rewatchable in that there are a lot of hidden details in it that you will probably miss the first time that you watch it. So multiple viewings are recommended for this movie especially. I think the performances are where they need to be at. You know, they're nothing too spectacular, but I think that they are enough to carry the story forward. I think Jesse Plemons is great as one of the main characters, and Jesse Buckley as well. Toni Collette is great as the mom. David DeLuise is the dad. And it's a small cast, but they have an impact on the story in such a big way. And you'll know what I'm talking about when you check this out. Overall, one of my favorite movies that I've watched this year, and please watch it if you get the chance. Children of Men came out 2006, is directed by Alfonso Cuarón, and stars Clive Owen as a man who lives in a world where the human population has become sterile. And the movie begins with the last person being born getting murdered. And that news sort of travels throughout, and people just lose hope. And so there are all these terrorist attacks going on. All of a sudden, Clive Owen's character, Theo, gets wrapped up in sort of like this clandestine terrorist operation where they're trying to basically overthrow the government, but they also have like peaceful goals in mind. It's essentially based on a book that came out that is also titled Children of Men, but the book is very different from the movie. They take a lot of creative liberties, and I think for the better, because I actually read the book back in college, and it is kind of bare bones in the way that it approaches the story compared to the movie. The movie is very nuanced. It's a lot more personal, you know, it's a lot less distant from the characters in relation to the main character. The character of Julian in the book is a stranger to Clive Owen's character, whereas in the movie, she's his ex-wife. And so there's that already established relationship there between the two. They sort of have a repertoire together, whereas in the book, they don't know each other at all before the events of the story. And so I think that the changes really help. I think that they serve the purpose of the story for the better. The movie is shot wonderfully. It's shot very much like a documentary, so it kind of gives you that sort of like implication that things like this could happen and are already happening in the world. And I'm not talking about the sterilization of humanity. I'm just talking about the implications that that would bring, where there's a lot of problems with like immigration and concentration camps and war and things like that. terrorist organizations. The action in this movie is shot beautifully, and there are a lot of one-shot takes throughout, and a lot of long takes. It kind of reminded me a little bit of 1917 in that way. But of course, this movie came out like 15 years before it. It's got a consistent tone throughout the whole thing. There's this sense of like bleak dreariness, hopelessness that the characters have to endure. And then there is something that does happen that kind of brings that spark of hope back that really carries the characters and the story forward in a way that's very believable. And thought this was a wonderful movie. Check it out. Fantastic Mr. Fox, one of the first Wes Anderson movies that I watched this year, although not the first Wes Anderson movie I've ever seen. I really loved Grand Budapest Hotel and Moonrise Kingdom, although I did just remember Darjeeling Limited, which I also loved. I think Fantastic Mr. Fox is, what the title implies. It's fantastic. Haha, get it? Hee hee. But it is essentially about a fox who has a family, played by George Clooney, who has to provide for his family, but also they don't want him to like steal anything because he's a sly fox, and they want him. His wife specifically wants him to give up that life, but at the same time he can't help himself. That's who he is, and that's always who he has been. And the movie is very charming, of course. It is very well shot. It is very symmetrical in that Wes Anderson style. It is very well voice acted. I really loved the voices in this, especially Jason Schwartzman as his son, who wears the mask the whole time and the cape because he's different from everybody else. I thought this movie was great in terms of music, of course. Wes Anderson always has really good soundtracks in his movies. I just thought that this was a really enjoyable, fun, lighthearted movie, and I think it's definitely one of the more cheerful movies that I've watched this year, because I tend to gravitate towards something a little more depressing. But this movie was great. Highly recommend it, especially if you're a Wes Anderson fan. Should be towards the top of people's Wes Anderson lists as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, give it a watch. Parasite is a South Korean film directed by Bong Joon-ho and is essentially about the class struggles in Korea. It's about a family who is on the poor side of things, who managed to sort of manipulate their way into finding jobs for themselves in this wealthy family's home. The movie plays out in a way that is kind of like a heist movie in a way, but is also not. Part of the way through. I thought this film was fantastic. I thought it was shot beautifully. It's the only Bong Joon-ho movie I've seen, and I know I need to check out more of them, so hopefully I'll be able to do that this next year. It is also one of the first foreign movies that I've seen this year. I thought the story was great and intricate, and it felt like a very different type of movie than a lot of other movies out there, in that it's not tied down to one specific genre. A lot of times it's kind of a comedy, and then another times it's more of a heist movie, and then in some certain elements there's kind of even like horror movie elements to it. Thought the acting was great. I thought the family dynamic between both families was very fun to watch and quite interesting the entire time. There was never a moment where I was bored or looking away or wondering when the movie was going to end. It had me enthralled throughout the entire thing. There's a reason why I think this movie is hyped up so much and why it won so many Academy Awards. Say what you will about the Oscars, but I think they got the awards for this one quite right, in that it deserves a lot of the praise that it got, because I went into this movie knowing that it was very beloved and very hyped. Normally when you go into a movie with that knowledge, it kind of takes away from the experience of watching it a little bit. This is one of the few cases where it didn't do that for me, and I think that if a movie can do that, if it can set those expectations and then deliver on those expectations, then it deserves the praise that it gets. Oldboy, directed by Park Chan-wook, is about a man who is kidnapped and forced to live in this isolated room for 15 years. He gets out and sort of sets out to find his captors and get revenge on them. This movie came out in 2003, is also a South Korean film. This is very much a tragedy in every sense of the word. I thought the acting in this movie was spectacular, especially from Choi Min-sik, who plays Oh Dae-soo. This movie is very stylistic. It has a very defined sort of cinematography about it that is very unique to itself and kind of establishes a sort of style that you don't find in many other movies, including the 2013 remake of Oldboy, which I will get into later in this video. This movie's quite hard to find. I actually had to borrow it from a friend who had a Blu-ray copy of it. So if you're having trouble finding this anywhere, I suggest using either a VPN or getting a copy for yourself from Amazon. But again, this movie is excellent. I thought the performances were amazing. I thought the story was interesting enough to the point where it wasn't convoluted, but also that it was complicated, that it had a lot going on. And I use the word complicated not as an insult, because it's a very complex movie with a lot of moving parts and a lot to think about. There are a lot of nuances throughout the story that I think people can view and appreciate and love. If you love revenge movies, this is very much a different kind of revenge movie. It sort of takes the concept and flips it on its head, and it's very impressive for a movie that came out in 2003. Again, I won't spoil anything, but please check this one out if you get the chance. Be sure you get the 2003 Oldboy, the South Korean version, not the 2013 American remake. That is garbo. American Psycho is a 2000 movie directed by Mary Harron, starring Christian Bale, and it is an iconic movie for a reason. I'm sure you've gone through YouTube, and if you're even remotely interested in movies, I'm sure you've seen scenes of this pop up on your feed in one way or another, most notably probably the business card scene. I thought this movie was great. It's very satirical in the way that it presents the character and the situations that he finds himself in. It's sort of commentating on consumerism and the way that vanity works. It's sort of poking fun at the whole concept of being a refined person and propping yourself up as someone who is better than everybody else. And it takes that concept and it rips off the mask, and you get to see it kind of for what it represents. And it's represented through the character of Patrick Bateman, who is a serial killer who tries his best to keep up his own appearance and make himself look better in the eyes of others while also being a psychopath. Some great performances in this. Obviously, Bale is great, and then you've got Willem Dafoe, who plays the detective, and Jared Leto, who kind of plays a sort of rival character to Patrick Bateman. This movie definitely benefits from rewatches. I think that it has a lot to offer and it has a lot to say. It kind of dips its toe into sort of the surreal elements of what Patrick Bateman is going through. This movie touches on quite a bit, and I think it does so very effectively for the most part. My favorite scene is obviously when he's talking to Jared Leto about his music preferences. I think that one is very enjoyable to watch. So yeah, check it out. Mandy, which is directed by Panos Cosmatos, which is the most badass director name I think I have ever come across, and stars Nicolas Cage as a man who lives with his, I think, wife or girlfriend, one of the two, in the middle of the woods, where he's a lumberjack and she's kind of like this artist. So their house is very secluded, but it's also very nice looking aesthetically. It's got all these different like artsy things going on. And essentially the story is about how Mandy is walking down the road one day and she gets kidnapped by these cult members that are led by this dude named Jeremiah Sand. The movie is essentially about Nicolas Cage doing his best to get back at the guys who took his wife. This movie is very much a excellent Nicolas Cage movie. It is one of the most beautifully shot movies that I've ever seen. This is one of the last movies that Johan Johansson worked on before he passed away. The cinematography is beautiful, and I think the music matches the tone of it very well. It's very much inspired by kind of those old like mythical adventure stories, or even like different elements of like sci-fi stories in there. I was reading online that when Panos Cosmatos was a kid, he would love to go to video stores and movie stores, and he would look at the covers of movies that he wasn't able to watch because they were rated R, and he would essentially make up his own story about what they were about based on what the covers looked like. And a lot of the times the covers of these things were stylistic in that they were like giving off this vibe of like an adventure in like this fantasy universe or sci-fi universe, things of that nature. And so he became obsessed with that idea, and you can see that style implemented a lot in Mandy. I think Nicolas Cage is excellent in this movie. He's able to give sort of both a reserved performance and also that classic Nicolas Cage crazy batshit performance that he's very well known for. And the movie kind of has two halves. It starts very, very slow. It takes its time to like build up the situation that's about to happen, and then the situation happens and Nicolas Cage is thrust into this sort of environment and he has to deal with it, and he essentially becomes a one-man army in taking out these people. And it's super fun to watch. It's one of the most fun to watch movies I think I've had the pleasure of viewing this year. If you love Nicolas Cage and you love kind of like a bare bones revenge story that is very stylistic and has excellent music, definitely recommend this one. Another Round, also directed by Thomas Vinterberg, starring Mads Mikkelsen as well, much like The Hunt, is about a group of high school teachers who conduct an experiment amongst themselves to see whether or not maintaining a blood alcohol level of 0.05 can lead to essentially a happier, better life. And the whole movie is about them sort of testing this theory out, kind of adding different variations to it, whether or not if they drink less or if they drink more, if it can get better or worse for them. And the movie is basically about the consequences of doing such an experiment in a real-time environment like a high school. And it's very much a sort of comedy drama kind of thing. There are funny elements to it, there are very humorous elements to it, but there are also kind of tragic elements to it as well. Again, another great performance from Mads Mikkelsen, and the supporting cast is awesome as well. Thomas Bo Larsen returns to this movie from The Hunt, and I think he, as well as the other supporting cast members, are also very great in it. Everybody feels natural to the environment that they're in. It all feels like it's very cohesive. If you really liked The Hunt and you've just loved Mads Mikkelsen also, I recommend checking out this movie. It was a great experience. Pig, directed by Michael Sarnowski, also starring Nicolas Cage, is a story about a man who is kind of secluded in the woods with his pet pig, and essentially something happens to where his pig is taken and he's got to go get his pig back. And this movie has kind of marketed itself as sort of like a John Wick but with a pig sort of thing. It kind of presented itself as like this standard revenge story where Nick Cage has to go out and he's got to get revenge on these guys. And at first that's kind of what it starts as, but as the movie progresses, it gets surprisingly creative with the way that it presents the story. It's a very different type of movie. It goes from like kind of like this revenge movie to almost this character study about who this guy was and who he used to be. And this movie is more essentially about who Nicolas Cage was as a character versus who he is in that moment now. And I think it's such a refreshing take on the sort of revenge story. I think Nicolas Cage gives a great subdued performance in this. You know, he's not necessarily that crazy, you know, balls to the walls Nicolas Cage that we're used to, but I think that he puts a lot of effort into the movies that he does, and the effort that he puts into this is a very subtle performance that works very effectively, and it's very emotional throughout. Nicolas Cage doesn't talk a lot in this movie, but I think that the performance that he gives is great in terms of physicality, in terms of the facial expressions that he makes, the sort of situation that he finds himself in. You know, he's this kind of loner, disheveled, broken man who lives in the woods and now has to find himself searching through this populated area where he feels kind of alienated, and you know that there's something going on that happened in his past that he's just not ready to confront just yet. This movie was very surprising and in a very good way, and I recommend that people check this out if they enjoy a good subdued Nicolas Cage performance with a story that goes into a place that you don't expect it to. Saint Maud, directed by Rose Glass, is about a young woman who, after a tragic event, becomes a devout Catholic. She then gets a job as sort of like this care nurse who is assigned to care for this cancer patient who is an American woman who is in her 40s, and she used to be a dancer. And essentially the movie is about this young woman who is trying to convert this woman as she's dying of cancer. I think this movie flew under a lot of people's radars because I remember it being marketed pretty heavily, especially on YouTube advertisements. And after the movie came out, I think it just kind of fell off and nobody really talked about it. But this was one of my favorite movies of the year, and I really enjoyed this movie for what it was, which was sort of this character study of this woman who is going through this kind of life-altering sort of personality change that she kind of entombs on herself and puts herself through the situation where she feels like she has to go around and kind of save the people that she thinks need saving. And it's a very interesting dynamic to watch, especially when you have the knowledge of she never used to be this way all the time. She used to be pretty normal and kind of sort of a young social woman who really enjoyed her life, and then this tragic thing happened, and now she feels like she has to devote herself to God and kind of force other people to devote themselves to God as well. And it's a very compelling thing to watch. The story itself is kind of loose. There's really no tight plot point. There's really no tight through line throughout. It's just sort of like this look at this character and getting a glimpse at her psyche and who she is as this broken person. I think the performance is great. I think Morfydd Clark plays an excellent role in this. She really gives a great performance as Saint Maud, or Katie as you come to learn in the movie. And that's not really a spoiler because you get that sense pretty early on. This movie sort of reminded me a little bit of Joker in the way that it's about a character who just starts to become really unhinged and fed up with the environment around her, while also mixing in different elements of horror movies such as Hereditary and The Witch. Cinematically, I thought this was a great movie. I thought it was very unique in the way it presented itself. Again, reminded me a lot of horror movies like Hereditary and The Witch. If you really like A24 movies and you like unconventional horror / thrillers, I definitely recommend watching Saint Maud, a great first feature film entry from director Rose Glass. The Master, directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, starring Joaquin Phoenix, the late Philip Seymour Hoffman, and Amy Adams. I think this movie was a great film to watch. And again, this is a film that's more of a character study for both the characters of Freddy and Philip Seymour Hoffman's character, who's playing like this sort of L. Ron Hubbard type figure. And essentially it's about these two characters who find themselves and have this kind of toxic friendship where they both kind of need each other in a way, but they're also very bad for each other. And a lot of the fun in watching this movie is watching these two characters interact and sort of try to gauge where they're at in terms of their relationship. Thought this was a great Paul Thomas Anderson film. I think I like There Will Be Blood a little bit more than this one. There Will Be Blood kind of stuck with me more, and this movie is great, but it runs the risk of kind of feeling like there's no point, there's no purpose to it, and it's just essentially making fun of Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard, which I'm, don't have a problem with at all. And I think that's what a lot of people will think if they watch this movie, but it's essentially a character study. And if that's something you enjoy, which is something that I do enjoy, then I think you'll really like this movie. The Mitchells vs. the Machines, directed by Mike Rianda, also involving Lord and Miller, the guys who did the Lego movie, is an animated film that is essentially about this family who decides to take a road trip together to the main character's college, who is Katie Mitchell. And essentially while they're on their road trip, this phone company goes haywire, and they essentially start to try to dominate the world with evil robots. And this is a very fun movie to watch. It's a very lighthearted movie. It's a movie where there's not really a whole lot of stakes, because the whole appeal of it is that it just kind of feels like one dank meme the whole time. It's a very funny movie that is always moving, always rapid paced, and it's essentially just sort of like this non-stop energy that it has throughout. There are little moments of quiet character situations and character moments that are sprinkled throughout, but essentially for the most part it's just kind of a non-stop comedy. I really enjoyed this movie. I could definitely tell that it involved the same people that made Into the Spider-Verse. It's very colorful. I thought the music was kind of reminiscent of that same sort of style too. This is all around a very fun movie that I think a lot of people, if they watch, will enjoy. And there's really not much about it that I had an issue with. It's on Netflix, so if you have a Netflix account, give it a go. It's a very easily digestible movie. Taxi Driver was directed by Martin Scorsese and starring Robert De Niro, came out in 1975, I believe, and is essentially about a taxi driver, played by Robert De Niro, who throughout the runtime of the movie becomes more and more unhinged, more kind of delusional in the way that he views himself and that he views other people. As the story goes forward, he kind of becomes more and more enwrapped in like the violence that he sort of indulges into and creates himself. And this movie is really about a false sense of kind of righteousness that an individual would put on themselves, kind of like this self-designated vigilante in a way. This movie's got a great performance from Robert De Niro, of course, and I think the performances from the supporting cast are amazing. I didn't realize that Peter Boyle was in this movie, who plays like one of his cab buddies. Peter Boyle also played Frank on Everybody Loves Raymond, which was a show that I watched extensively as a kid for some reason, and it's just kind of interesting seeing him in a movie that is almost 5 decades old now. I thought Jodie Foster was pretty good, although I will admit her performance as a child actress is kind of overshadowed by Robert De Niro. Obviously, when you have kid actors in a movie, it can sort of be difficult to work with them. But nonetheless, I feel like it's something that I have to mention. Despite being an older movie, the thought that it was an older movie never really crossed my mind because I was so enraptured and engulfed in all the things going on in it, and to me that is a very positive thing to take away. Overall, I thought this movie was great and I highly enjoyed watching it. Definitely check it out if you enjoy these types of movies. Lady Bird is an A24 movie directed by Greta Gerwig and is about this high school girl who goes to this Catholic school, and it's essentially sort of like a year in the life of this character. You really get to know her personality and kind of like get to follow her throughout this school year and the ups and downs being a teenage girl brings. I think this movie is super well acted, especially on the part of Saoirse Ronan as Christine, Lady Bird, and especially on the part of Laurie Metcalf, who plays her mother. Laurie Metcalf I only really know from being around my dad when he watches Big Bang Theory because she plays Sheldon's mom, and it's so nice to see her in something that makes it so that it differentiates her acting ability from that TV show because, oh boy. But yeah, I thought this movie was really intimate. It was very grounded in the way that it presented itself, but it was also humorous and had enough personality to keep you enwrapped in the story of it. And essentially, it's just following a year of this high school girl's life as she goes through these different sort of struggles and emotional ups and downs and sort of the implications of being someone of that age in early 2002. Thought this movie overall was great, and I think it's one of the better A24 movies that I've seen. So yeah, have a look, have a cheeky look. Sound of Metal is directed by Darius Martyr, starring Riz Ahmed, and is essentially about a young drummer who begins to lose his hearing and the implication that it brings of not being able to do the thing that you love anymore because of a health condition. This movie is very much a personal movie. It follows Riz Ahmed's character the entire time. You really get the sense of tragedy and life-changing sorrow that he goes through because of this event. Of course, I thought the sound design in this movie was really immaculate and very well done. One of the best parts of this film. I thought that, as someone who has retained his hearing for up until this moment in his life, I thought that it seemed pretty accurate to what someone who is losing their hearing would actually go through. I think the pacing was great. I think that it had a perfect runtime, and I think it has an ending that is very fitting to where the character ends up throughout the entire film and throughout his journey. Overall, this is a movie that is kind of tragic but a little bittersweet at the same time. It's got elements of hope and it's also got elements of despair, and I think they're both really well done. I highly recommend this movie. Primer is a 2004 movie directed by Shane Carruth, also starring Shane and his friend David Sullivan. This movie was made with a budget of $7,000 and ended up making $841,000 at the box office. You can tell that this is a low budget film when you watch it, and I think that is mainly the only negative thing that I have to say about it, because the way that it presents itself and the way that it tells the story of these two who essentially make a time machine is very well crafted and very well presented. Essentially what they did in making this film is they made it with the idea that they weren't going to dumb down any of the dialogue or any of the ideas that they present in the movie, and so they leave it up to the viewer to kind of figure it out for themselves. It's a shorter film going at 77 minutes, so you have a chance to watch it multiple times and kind of pick up on things that you wouldn't have necessarily otherwise picked up on the first time. I think that this movie definitely benefits from multiple viewings because the story, while not overly complicated, I think can definitely make you scratch your head and go, what the hell just happened? And essentially the main appeal from this movie comes from just trying to figure out the through line of it all and how it all works and what is essentially happening to these characters, and also which characters are the same characters. Obviously that's not the only appeal of the movie. I think the music's great. I think the acting is very well done, especially on Shane Carruth's part. You get to see his character kind of transform throughout the starting off as kind of like this hopeful visionary for something that created, to being someone who's jaded and sort of becomes enwrapped in sort of the power that building a time machine would bring. I think this movie in a way made Tenet look like baby's first time travel movie, but I think with any time travel movie it sort of has that effect. It's a very bold and very enjoyable independent movie. Makes you think about the deeper implications of time travel and how it would or maybe wouldn't necessarily work. So if you like movies that you don't mind rewatching over and over again to pick up on different things you might have missed, give this one a watch. Knives Out is a 2019 movie directed by Ryan Johnson, starring Daniel Craig, Chris Evans, Ana de Armas, and a whole ensemble cast. It's a murder mystery movie where this family tries to figure out who is responsible for the death of their grandfather, and Daniel Craig and Lakeith Stanfield are hired as detectives in trying to figure out what exactly happened. I thought as far as like a murder mystery goes, this movie was pretty compelling. It sort of takes that element of it and sort of not necessarily flips it on its head, but twists it in a way to where you're trying to figure out how it's orchestrated and how and why it all took place rather than who did it, if that makes any sense. And essentially, Ana de Armas steals the show in this movie. I think that she's incredible. I think that she plays a very compelling character who is essentially like sort of the housemaid / caretaker for the grandfather. And she plays someone who throughout the whole movie is very conflicted on the situations that are happening, and I think acting wise it comes across very effectively. Of course, I think Daniel Craig is awesome in this as well, and I think Chris Evans really also carries a good portion of this movie too. It's very refreshing to see him in a role that's not a charismatic superhero, and he's essentially more of a slimeball rich kid who's spoiled beyond imagination. I think that this movie is quite enjoyable, and if you like a fun, slightly goofy murder mystery movie, give this one a watch. Requiem for a Dream is directed by Darren Aronofsky, starring Jared Leto, Jennifer Connelly, Marlon Wayans, and Ellen Burstyn, and is essentially follows the adventures, or I guess misadventures, of different types of drug abuse. It follows these characters who go through these events while under the influence of different substances such as heroin, cocaine, diet pills, this sort of thing. And the movie is essentially about different types of addiction. You know, I think a lot of people when they watch this movie think to themselves, oh, this is just an anti-drug movie. Essentially, it's more of an anti-addiction movie and how our different vices can kind of control us rather than us controlling them. This movie has a very unique cinematography to it. It's shot in a way that kind of evokes that sort of anxiety when watching characters go through these different situations. It is a very bleak and dark and sort of hopeless movie that I don't think will appeal to a lot of people, but is very well done for what it is. Having watched Trainspotting and this in the same year, I think I have to admit that I like this more because it, I think, really effectively shows the desperation in the characters and the situations that they find themselves in. I think that it is very effective in sort of hammering home the idea that you can end up in a situation that nobody would ever want to find themselves in if you keep indulging in the lifestyle that you're indulging in. And I think that it is overall a very well done movie. Acting wise, I think Jared Leto and Jennifer Connelly are great. Marlon Wayans gives an excellent performance as somebody who you can tell is just sort of on the verge of regret of all these decisions, but he just keeps finding himself in the cycle of things. And absolutely, Ellen Burstyn gives an excellent performance as this woman who just unfortunately becomes enwrapped in the idea of being on TV, and to do so she has to take these diet pills which start to affect her psyche, start to affect her mood, affect her everyday life as far as like having hallucinations go. And of course, I think that the music is iconic in this. I definitely have heard the soundtrack of this movie before I've seen it because a lot of YouTubers like to use it in like their videos that they used to edit in like 2007, 2008 for some reason. This whole movie is essentially a downward spiral for 4 different characters who end up in 4 different equally horrible situations. And if you enjoy the sort of drama and character transformations that they go through and conditions that someone like them would find themselves in sort of a hyper stylized way, then I think you'll enjoy this movie. The Matrix, directed by the Wachowskis, starring Keanu Reeves, Carrie-Anne Moss, Lawrence Fishburne, and many others, is an action film about a character named Thomas Anderson who finds out that he is basically in a simulation that is controlled by the machines who have taken over the world, and he has to use the Matrix to his advantage in helping the people that took him out of that world. This movie is iconic. It's very much the starting point in the Matrix franchise, and it is by itself a great film. The action is very well done for a movie that came out in 1999, and I think overall it has a consistent style that matches with the action that it portrays, and the action that it portrays is very well done, very well choreographed, and is something that is very consistent throughout the main trilogy of movies, at least as far as action goes. I think the sort of mystery of the Matrix itself and the mystery of Zion and humanity and what the implications of that means is a very big appeal to the film. And it sort of established this trend of action in movies that kind of moved forward from then on out, such as slow motion and bullet time, using kung fu in movies that have sort of this heightened sense of reality. I think that this movie is amazing, and I think it stands on its own as a solid solo movie. Also, of course, it's got my boy Keanu in it, and you know, I love me some Keanu. To be a common internet boy, I will admit that he is essentially my favorite person, at the risk of sounding like a normie. Alien, directed by Ridley Scott, came out in 1979, starring Sigourney Weaver, Tom Skerritt, Veronica Cartwright, is essentially a sci-fi horror film in which a alien gets loose on a cargo ship, and the crew members have to try to figure out how to either escape from it or kill it. It's a very simple plot. It's a very sort of bare bones kind of situation, but it's essentially very effective in the way that it presents itself, that it sort of makes up for having such a straightforward plot. Going into this movie, I knew the things that would happen, and I knew what the fates of the characters were, especially seeing as how there are multiple sequels to Alien with the same character in it. But even with knowing that information, the tension really wasn't lost on me. I was still pretty enwrapped in everything that was happening. Tonally, I thought that sort of helped in my investment in what was happening to the characters. I think that the sound design was crazy good in this, especially on the part of the creature. I thought that it was very effective in sort of making you feel like you were there, kind of experiencing this looming horror with the crew members on board. And I think a lot of the appeal of this movie is kind of like the mystery behind what the situation is. You know, The fact that you never go see Earth or any other people in the movie is, I think, a great decision on the story's part. I think that kind of mysterious element of it all really helps elevate the movie into a level that it wouldn't have otherwise been in. And I think that there's a reason why this movie is very iconic, in that it established a lot of elements that you really didn't see before then. A science fiction horror film. Thought that this was a creepy, effective, and overall exciting movie to watch, despite the fact that I knew what was going to take place. If you're a fan of horror movies and you're a fan of sci-fi and you're just a fan of well executed, effective, simple stories, then I think you'll really enjoy this. Pusher 2 with Nicholas Winding Refn, starring Mads Mikkelsen, directed by Nicholas Winding Refn, I should say, is the second movie in the Pusher trilogy. Pusher is a movie that came out 1996, I believe, and was Nicholas Winding Refn's first feature film. And this is the sequel to that movie. We'll talk about the first Pusher later. This movie, I think, is the best out of the trilogy. It is about Mads Mikkelsen's character, who just gets out of prison, and he's trying to make things right with his dad while also confronting the fact that he's now a new father figure. This movie's very emotional. It's very up and down. It's a roller coaster. It is very much shot in the similar style that the first movie was shot in, which was very much like a documentary, almost kind of over-the-shoulder POV style, but for the most part, I believe that style originated from the fact that the first movie had kind of a small budget, whereas this movie, you can tell that Nicholas Winding Refn has a little bit more money behind it. The production value is a little bit better than the first movie, but nonetheless, it retains that signature style. Overall, I think this movie's story is a little more cohesive and a little better than both the first and the third one in this series of movies, and it's my personal favorite out of the three. I think Mads Mikkelsen kills it, and I think that the story that plays out is so consistently good. It just manages to stick with you. Of course, you don't have to watch the first Pusher to understand this one, but if you do want to watch the first Pusher, it kind of helps you understand Mads Mikkelsen's character a little bit better. Pulp Fiction by Quentin Tarantino. This one stars John Travolta, Samuel L. Jackson. You guys all know it. This was really one of the first movies to kind of shoot Quentin Tarantino into stardom, into sort of the upper echelon of directors that people think of nowadays. And I think that for a good reason. This movie is pretty well done. I can see why it's as successful as it is. There's a big reason why people talk about that. The story is very good. It is kind of split up into a series of vignettes that are connected in some way or another. You've got characters like John Travolta and Samuel L. Jackson who play two hitmen. Then you've got the character of played by Bruce Willis, who is a boxer who is told to take a fall, but then things don't necessarily go the way that they plan out. This movie is kind of wild. It embraces that sort of violent Tarantino style and that witty dialogue that he's known for. I think John Travolta is great in this movie, and Samuel L. Jackson as well. He kind of steals the show, as well as Bruce Willis. I think this is a great Bruce Willis movie overall. If you like Tarantino, it's hard to miss out on this one, so if you haven't seen it, then what are you doing? The Wrestler by Darren Aronofsky, starring Mickey Rourke, is a psychological sports drama, kinda, except there's not really that much wrestling in it, if I'm being honest. It's more so about a character study of this guy who's like a washed up wrestling star who finds out that he has a heart condition to where if he plays wrestling again, he will die. So this character throughout the movie is just trying to figure out how to best live his life, kind of make amends to the people that he did wrong. And the movie is kind of like a tragic tale about a guy who really just keeps screwing up. And I think it's a very well done movie in that regards and portraying that sort of broken character. And it kind of mirrors Mickey Rourke's career in a way, because this movie was sort of a comeback for him, and the movie is kind of echoing that sort of same sentiment about somebody who's washed up, who is not as well regarded or well known as they used to be. And I think that it is a very well done movie. The Florida Project by Sean Baker is an A24 movie about this mother who lives with her daughter in a hotel room that is right next to Disney World in Florida. and it just kind of portrays the day-to-day life of this little girl who lives in an impoverished state with her friends. And the movie is kind of split up into three different perspectives. You've got the little girl's perspective, which is the main point of view. Then you've got the mom's perspective, who the mom is kind of, you can tell, is this really irresponsible, immature, kind of trashy individual who doesn't have her life together at all, but really cares about her daughter. And then the third perspective is from Willem Dafoe's character, which I found the most interesting. He plays the owner of the hotel and does his best to upkeep what he knows to be a sort of dying business that he's in. And the movie is just kind of a fascinating sort of fly-on-the-wall type movie where you just get to observe these people's lives. There's barely any music that plays in the film. The only music that you really get is kind of towards the beginning and the end of the film, whereas everything sort of feels like you're observing it from a very objective point of view. You know, it's not really asking you to sort of take sides or look at it through a certain lens, because it portrays it in a pretty clear and objective way, like I said. Very well done movie, really great A24 movie, and I think a lot more people need to see it. Donnie Darko by Richard Kelly, starring Jake Gyllenhaal. This movie, I knew that I had to watch it at some point, but somebody at work told me that it was their favorite movie, so I had to check it out, and of course I can understand why, because it is very well done, very metaphorical, kind of almost horror-like movie, psychological thriller in a way, but it's about this kid named Donnie Darko who is very much jaded and sort of disenchanted with everyday life and the people in it, and he has these psychological issues where he sees this figment of his imagination in the form of a rabbit named Frank who talks to him and tells him that the world is going to end. And this movie is a very good, I would say, character study, perspective, metaphorical movie. It's got a lot of symbolism, has a lot of different meanings, a lot of different interpretations as to what it exactly is. And I think if you really enjoy a good Jake Gyllenhaal performance and you enjoy a good atmospheric movie, then check this one out. Adaptation, directed by Spike Jonze, written by Charlie Kaufman. This was one of the 3 Charlie Kaufman movies that I saw this past year. One of the best Nicolas Cage movies I've seen, although a lot of the Nicolas Cage movies I saw were really good. So that's not too hard to say. But this story is essentially about Charlie Kaufman as a character played by Nicolas Cage, who is doing his best to adapt a book about an orchid thief into a feature film. And this movie is a very Charlie Kaufman style movie. It's very meta. It kind of acknowledges itself and sort of puts itself in its own situations. And the reason for Charlie Kaufman making himself a character is very intriguing and sort of gives you that sort of insight into the writing process that he goes through pretty much every time he writes a script. But this movie is very well done, very well acted. I really like Nicolas Cage in this. He gives a really good, subtle character performance as Charlie Kaufman and as Donald Kaufman, his twin brother, who Charlie Kaufman does not have a twin brother in real life. So that is in itself kind of telling of the kind of movie that it is, a sort of heightened reality, hyperbolic, situational type film. Really good film. One of the best screenplays out of all the movies that I've seen, and it's a really smart, witty, and kind of tongue-in-cheek movie at the same time, so definitely check it out. Akira is a 1988 Japanese animated film directed by Katsuhiro Otomo. It is about a group of bikers who live in Neo-Tokyo in the aftermath of sort of this nuclear fallout, but civilization's kind of rebuilt itself, but things aren't as easy as they are in modern times. It's kind of set in like the near future, very cyberpunk aesthetic. And one of the bike members, I think his name is Tatsuka, has a run-in with this mutant kid, and Tatsuka starts to get powers of his own. And the movie is really just about trying to contain and sort of quell this superhuman, otherworldly ability that's kind of being unleashed on the city. And this movie is gorgeous, first of all. That's probably the most that it has going for it. Being all hand-drawn animation, it looks very stunning. And I think that also the voice acting, and I watched this subbed, and I think the voice acting is really passionate and really sets the tone for the movie. I would say that the story itself is really good, and it makes you ask the questions of whether or not humanity is ready to obtain a certain amount of power that only those who reach godhood could attain, and kind of makes you ask whether or not we're actually ready to have something like that. Spoiler alert, we're not at all. But yeah, really good film, really good Japanese animated film, so check it out. I believe it's on Hulu. Spider-Man No Way Home, directed by John Watts, starring, of course, Tom Holland, is the third movie in the John Watts Spider-Man Home trilogy, and we saw this in theaters pretty much opening night because we knew if we saw it any later, we would definitely get spoiled for it. And sure enough, there are spoilers all over the internet, but regardless, the movie itself is probably one of the best MCU movies I've seen. Definitely one of the best Spider-Man movies I've seen. I still think that Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man 2 is a little bit better, but I need to revisit that since it's been years since I've watched it. But regardless, if you're a Spider-Man fan, if you're a fan of the MCU, if you're a fan of previous iterations of Spider-Man and references to characters from there, and that's not really a spoiler because the villains from the previous movies were in the trailer, then you're really going to like this movie, and I really like this movie. So there you have it. Bronson, directed by Nicholas Winding Refn, is starring Tom Hardy and is the story about Charles Bronson, who is the UK's most notorious prisoner and most expensive prisoner. It's essentially a character study about this real-life figure who has a history of violence and institution inside prison, going in and out all the time. I think this movie is one of Nicholas Winding Refn's better movies. I think that the performance that Tom Hardy gives is excellent. Personally, I think the pacing is a little too slow for my liking, but then again, that's sort of what Nicholas Winding Refn is known for, is not having the greatest pacing in a lot of his films. I think for the most part, the story is pretty cohesive. It's not trying to be too convoluted. It's not trying to take too much creative liberty, I'd say. It's pretty true to form, I think, to what the actual person did from what I could read about online. And it's very consistent throughout, and the tone stays pretty consistent. I guess if I did have a criticism, like I said before, it would be the pacing. I wish that it kind of got along a little bit faster, but that's just my point of view. Overall, I think this movie's good. I think it's one of the better Nicholas Winding Refn films. So yeah, I recommend it. All right, I Saw the Devil, directed by Kim Ji-woon, is about a police officer whose wife gets murdered by a serial killer, and he has to try his best to track the killer down and get revenge. This is sort of a classic revenge style story, kind of in the same vein as Oldboy, and it even stars Choi Min-sik as the main villain in the movie, who, if you don't know, played the main character in 2003 Oldboy. This movie is, I think, very stylistic in the way that it portrays the story. It's very gritty. It's kind of sort of this dark, almost noir tone to it, but it essentially is pretty much a straightforward revenge thriller that has a lot of violence in it. And I think that for the most part, the violence serves a purpose, but there is a point where it kind of feels pretty gratuitous and needlessly violent, if I'm being quite frank, which I know can turn a lot of people off, and it sort of detracts from the experience of the story. Almost becomes too flashy, to say the least. But otherwise, I think this movie is really well done. I think it's really well acted, and I think that the cinematography in it is really good, really consistent. So yeah, check this one out if you're a fan of revenge thrillers in any way, shape, or form. Nobody, directed by Ilya Nash-Schuler. He's the person who did Hardcore Henry, so I have to watch that yet to see how that shapes up as an action movie. But this movie stars Bob Odenkirk from Better Call Saul fame, and if you are curious, the movie is about a man who is a family man, and one day he is pretty much forced to sort of come out of retirement from being like this sort of assassin dude, kind of like a John Wick style, and it is produced by David Leitch, who directed the first John Wick movie, and is written by Derek Kolstad, who wrote all 3 John Wick movies that have come out so far. I think that definitely the writing there shows. I think that the writing is pretty simple as far as like a story goes and character beats go. And essentially, I think that's kind of the weakest part of the movie is the characters themselves and how almost sort of two-dimensional they are. They're not really one-dimensional, but I wouldn't say they're three-dimensional either. They're just kind of they have like 2 traits each, I would say, maybe some of them even less. It's sort of bare bones as far as character relationships and character personality go. As far as action goes, I think this is one of the best movies for that genre. I think that the action in it is superb, specifically the bus scene that is very heavily promoted in all the trailers that came out for this movie. And if you enjoy action that you can experience, and if you enjoy John Wick-like action, and if you really like Bob Odenkirk doing something other than comedy, then I think this movie is a treat for you to enjoy, like it was for me. 500 Days of Summer, directed by Mark Webb, stars Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Zooey Deschanel. It is a kind of romantic comedy drama movie about this guy who meets this girl at work and they form a relationship, and it's very much from Joseph Gordon-Levitt's perspective, but essentially he gets really deep feelings for her when her feelings for him aren't that deep, and the movie kind of portrays that in separated, non-chronological order in various days of the summer, or days of summer, because her name is Summer, I should say. So it's very much an out-of-order romantic comedy film, and I think I like this movie a lot more than I expected to. I think that when it comes to romantic comedy movies, I'm not really too keen on that sort of genre, but the way that this was portrayed and the stylistic choices that they made and the cinematography, I think really impressed me. I think that the acting is really good, especially from Joseph Gordon-Levitt's part. I think that he really carries the movie in a way that not a whole lot of people would be able to in a romantic comedy movie. Again, not my preferred genre. I think that the writing is good for the most part. I think it sort of gets across effectively the complicated nature of relationships and the fact that no 2 people can ever completely be on the same page, and how much of a degree of that are you willing to deal with in a relationship. Would have liked to see a little more, I guess, intimate moments between the character. A lot of the times Joseph Gordon-Levitt is left by himself and his own thoughts about it, and Zooey Deschanel kind of feels like a distant character, you don't really get her perspective on a lot of things, and I kind of wish that you did, just so that this movie could feel a little more even-keeled. But overall, I enjoyed this movie. I think that out of the romantic comedy movies that I've seen, it's definitely up there for me. Trainspotting, starring Ewan McGregor, directed by Danny Boyle, is about a group of heroin addicts in Scotland who get into a series of misadventures. Of course, the story is from Ewan McGregor's perspective, and I think I touched on this in a podcast episode, but I definitely feel like I like Requiem for a Dream more than I like this movie. This movie to me didn't feel as consistent. It didn't feel like it really stuck with a certain style that I would have liked to see. It really did kind of embrace that black comedy of it. It sort of felt a little too goofy at moments, specifically the scene with the bedsheet. And if you've seen the movie, you'll know what I'm talking about. But it is essentially a really good portrayal of these nuanced characters who are going through this sort of struggle of drug addiction and the different ways that it portrays that in various characters throughout the movie. It's a positive thing that it portrays it in kind of an ensemble way, because you get all these different perspectives of how drug abuse affects different people's lives in different ways, but at the same time, it is very much from Ewan McGregor's point of view, and he's even the narrator of the film, which I think he does a really good job. So overall, really good movie. Check it out. Dread, directed by Pete Travis, starring Carl Urban, is kind of like a remake movie of an older version of the character played by Sylvester Stallone, and is also based off a comic book, pretty much. It is essentially an action movie set in like the future about this super urbanized city that has all these skyscrapers and stuff. And the point of the movie is Judge Dredd and his deputy, I want to say, Anderson. Essentially, they have to reach the top of this building where this drug lord is at, and they have to bring her down. This movie is very tongue-in-cheek, very self-aware, pretty much knows what kind of movie it is, and the kind of movie that it is this sort of unabashed, really balls to the walls action movie with lots of guns and lots of fighting and lots of blood, and I think it's all the better for it. I think the fact that it embraces that sort of goofy comic book tone really sets it apart from a lot of other movies that kind of are based off of comic books, I would say. You get like that sort of gritty, heavy nature to it, while also you can acknowledge the fact that things are really goofy and sort of out there. I think that this movie overall is a decent movie. I think that if you like action movies, you're going to like this one. There's not too much in the way of character development or character evolution, because the movie doesn't really serve that kind of purpose, but nevertheless, it never hurts to sprinkle that in somewhere, and Judge Dredd definitely still feels like Judge Dredd after the movie's done. There's only like one real kind of change in it for his character, and I won't spoil it, but it's there. So yeah, check that out if that sounds like your thing. The Social Network, directed by David Fincher, written by Aaron Sorkin, starring Jesse Eisenberg, is about Mark Zuckerberg's creation of the social platform Facebook. I think that this movie aged really well in terms of time spanning. I think that people can look back at this movie and think that it's an instant classic. I really like the portrayals of each character in the movie. I think that Jesse Eisenberg does a really good job as Mark Zuckerberg. I think that role was pretty well casted, and I think that Andrew Garfield's performance was really good too. I think that Justin Timberlake is kind of a weak point in the movie, but I've never really been that impressed with him as an actor anyway. I thought he was fine. It was just kind of distracting from the good performances that we were getting from Andrew Garfield and Jesse Eisenberg when Justin Timberlake's there. It sort of takes away from the scenes a little bit, but not too much to where my enjoyment of the movie seemed to suffer that much. I think that as far as adaptations of real-life stories go, I think that this could have ended at maybe a little more climactic place. I think the conclusion of this movie felt a little flat. I think it felt a little anticlimactic. And when you're adapting a story from real life into fiction, of course there's going to be creative liberties that you can take. So I don't think people would have had an issue if the way that the story wrapped up in this film was a little more conclusive. Would really be interested in seeing a sequel to this movie, and I think that current events sort of call for something like it. So definitely check it out. I think it's a really good, really well-aged film. Grease, 1978 musical starring John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John, directed by Randall Kleiser. Is pretty much about high school students who are trying to find dates to the dance, the big dance, and it's essentially about John Travolta's character being in love with Olivia Newton-John's character, but they're two totally different personality types, and that kind of clashes in the movie. I think as far as musicals go, I think that this is one of the best ones that I've seen overall. I think that the energy that the actors bring to the dance performances and the singing performances really carries this movie forward. I was always impressed with how much they were flipping around and running around and jumping and constantly all over the place in this movie, and it was very well choreographed. So I think that is the best part of the film. I think that the performances were good, they were serviceable. It was very easy for me to tell that a lot of the high school students were not high school aged. For example, a lot of the actors were in their 30s when they were shooting this movie, and you can very well tell for a decent amount of them that they're a little bit older than they should be. And that sort of distracted from my overall cohesiveness of the experience, but I think that nevertheless, it's a fun movie. If you like musicals and you like John Travolta, then sure, check this one out. The Big Lebowski, directed by the Coen brothers, starring Jeff Bridges and John Goodman, is about this guy, I should say dude, who is named Jeff Lebowski, and when a mix-up happens over somebody who is wealthy who's also named Jeffrey Lebowski, when they come into the picture, things get complicated for Lebowski's life, or I should say the dude's life, because that's how he's referred to in the movie to differentiate himself from the rich Lebowski. This movie is a pretty much comedy movie. The story in this kind of serves as a secondary thing to the characters and the way that they interact with each other and the way that they're written. But I do think that the story is a little more cohesive than a lot of people have led me to believe before watching this movie. Because before I went in, I thought for sure that there would be barely any story and that any real story that there was there wouldn't kick off until like halfway through the movie. But there is consistently a thorough story throughout pretty much the entire movie, and I think that saying that there isn't a story kind of gives the movie a disservice. But me personally, it's kind of hard to get into comedy movies when I'm watching a movie like this by myself. That being said, I really enjoyed the characters in this movie. I think that they're really funny. Their personalities really shined through, especially when they were interacting with each other and the ridiculous situations that they found themselves in. I think that this movie is sort of grounded in a way that it sort of helps the believability of the characters in it, but at the same time, it's heightened to a sense of ridiculousness that it makes those grounded moments even better, and vice versa. I think that they play off each other really well. If you like a movie about well-written characters just kind of hanging out, doing their thing, finding themselves in really wacky situations, then this is the movie for you. Our Friend, directed by Gabriella Cowperthwaite. Excuse me if I butchered that, which I know I definitely did. Starring Jason Segel, Dakota Johnson, and Casey Affleck, is about this couple, Casey Affleck and Dakota Johnson, who find out that the wife has cancer, and their friend, played by Jason Segel, comes in and sort of helps take care of the family, take care of the kids, does what needs to be done around the house, and sort of establishes himself as that really good friend. And this movie is a very touching movie. It's a very character-driven movie about this really dire situation that they find themselves in, which is, of course, cancer. And the movie is sort of split up and divided into different time periods, told in a non-chronological way. And I think that it really works for the movie for the most part. There are some scenes that the dialogue kind of feels a little goofy, and the characters and the people in it sort of feel like they're too much in a soap opera sometimes, which is weird to say about a story that is based on true events. I think that overall the dialogue is well done, except for like a few certain scenes that kind of detracted from it. Some character moments felt a little silly and a little unrealistic, but at the same time, I think that this movie is overall a pretty well done movie. The performances in it are really good, especially from Casey Affleck. I think that he really gives a really good portrayal of a husband who is going through something as difficult as having a loved one going through cancer. If you like a good straight drama movie that's based on true stories, then Our Friend is a good movie to check out. Slumdog Millionaire, also directed by Danny Boyle, starring Dev Patel, is a drama film, I guess you could say, about this guy who goes on this Who Wants to Be a Millionaire episode, where he seems to get almost every answer right. And story is told in a series of flashbacks, when each different question makes him think back to an event in his life that led up to that moment. And I think that overall the story that is told in the flashbacks that leads up to the final events of the movie is a very well done story. I think that that's the strongest part of the film, and I think that the characters and the actor performances of those characters are really good too. Overall, the way this movie's shot, I think, is just kind of a standard movie. I didn't think there was anything too special about the cinematography or the way that it was portrayed. The way that it was filmed, it almost kind of felt like a Michael Bay movie at times, which is really weird to say, especially the stylistic way that Danny Boyle created Trainspotting. Definitely don't think this movie is as good as Trainspotting, but I think it's close. I think that it's still a really well done movie portraying a character that is pretty much going through all the events in his life up to that point. Overall, I think this movie is captivating, with albeit a few cheesy, unrealistic moments, but overall, I think it's really well done. And that's pretty much all I have to say about that. Pretty in Pink, directed by Howard Deutsch, starring Molly Ringwald, is about this high school girl who is pretty much torn between two different guys who she wants to go to the dance with or doesn't want to go to the dance with or whichever. And this movie is a really good kind of day in the life of this high school girl. She is very believably played by Molly Ringwald. I think that she was pretty much the face of high school girls in these sort of teenage romantic comedy movies. I think that John Cryer was one of my favorite parts of the film. He was very funny, energetic, and I think that he portrayed his character very effectively. At the same time, I think Harry Dean Stanton was kind of a weak point in it. His character just felt a little too wooden for me, a little too one note. Could have done with a little more personality on his part. Mainly his struggle in the film is just the fact that Molly Ringwald is poor and that he's rich and that his friends think that he should be dating somebody better than her. And that's sort of all his like character traits pretty much boiled down right there. I would have liked to see a little more nuance from that. But overall, I think this movie is a really well-made romantic comedy, sort of coming-of-age film. Definitely on the better side of that sort of genre. A Quiet Place, directed by John Krasinski, also starring John Krasinski and Emily Blunt, is about this family who is trying to survive a post-apocalyptic world where any noise that is made attracts these monsters that will come and instantly kill anybody that they come across. And this movie is a pretty well done post-apocalyptic movie, sort of like a horror style sort of thing. And I think that it does a really good job of sort of keeping it contained to this one family. It doesn't try to branch out or explore like the greater implications of the world, and it doesn't have any like world ending sort of weight to it. It's a very personal journey that you're on with these characters, and I think that it's really well done. I think that overall the premise of it is pretty consistent, although it sort of leaves to be desired. The characters in the movie themselves, you don't really get to see much of like who they are as people. You just kind of get the sense that you want to see them survive because they're a family and they're always in danger. And I would have liked a little more different character traits in the way that this movie was portrayed. I think that it could have benefited from something like that. That way we could get attached to the characters a little bit more than what we already were. But regardless, I think that it's a really well done post-apocalyptic horror movie, and very atmospheric, very effective, very consistent in the rules of the film. So yeah, check it out. Ex Machina, directed by Alex Garland, starring Domhnall Gleeson, Alicia Vikander, I think, and Oscar Isaac, is a sci-fi story about this guy who works for this tech company who basically wins a contest and is invited to the owner's house. The owner's house being in the middle of nowhere, and the owner being played by Oscar Isaac, who tells him that he wants his help in running a series of experiments and tests on this AI that he created and put in this almost lifelike robotic body named Ava. And essentially the movie, it kind of becomes a psychological thriller about whether or not Oscar Isaac's character is a little too unhinged to be doing this sort of thing, and kind of goes into the ethics of what is actually human. I think this movie does a really good job in asking those questions. I think that it really is effective in making you wonder the ethical implications of AI and sort of the progress of technology as a whole. I think that Oscar Isaac is by far the best part of the movie. I think that he plays the character really well, like insanely well. Almost so well that the other actors are kind of outshined in this movie. I thought Domhnall Gleeson could have done a little bit better job in portraying his character. I think that I really like him as an actor, and he's one of my favorites, but I would have liked to see a little more nuance, a little more character there than what we get, which is kind of just this meek, sort of nerdy loner character who is very much weirded out by the antics of Oscar Isaac, and rightfully so. Overall, I think this movie is very effective in making you ask the questions and the implications of artificial intelligence, and I think that overall, if you want a really good Oscar Isaac performance, then this is definitely the movie to watch. Leon the Professional, directed by Lucas Besson, is about a hitman who lives next door to this family, and when that family runs into trouble, he has to take care of this little girl played by Natalie Portman, who is hiding from this rogue cop played by Gary Oldman. I thought this movie was a pretty good new look at a sort of hitman tale. It's an older film, came out in 1994. And I think that the concept is very unique, very interesting, and I think that Gary Oldman kind of steals the show. He plays a really compelling villain who's this corrupt DEA agent who is responsible for a lot of the atrocities that happen in this movie. I think that the relationship between Leon and Matilda, who's played by Natalie Portman, is pretty compelling. I think it's pretty effective for the most part. There are some things in this movie that haven't really aged that well, particularly like some weird implications that are made in the movie. If you've seen it, you'll know what I'm talking about. But nevertheless, I think that the movie is overall a good movie to watch. It's a good action movie, and I think that the characters in it are very compelling, and the way that it's shot is pretty unique. I like the different sort of cinematic styles that it has. Overall, I think this is a pretty good movie. Silence, directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver, is about two Christian priests who have to go to Japan in order to basically rescue their mentor, who's played by Liam Neeson, and it's set in the 17th century. I thought the biggest thing that this movie had going for it is the acting and the cinematography. I thought that Andrew Garfield's performance throughout this movie was really well done. I think that it's probably my favorite movie that I've watched that he's been in, and I think that this movie visually is just very stunning. I think that overall this movie just really looks good and helps to tell the story in a very visually compelling way. I think that if I had a criticism of this movie, it would be the pacing. I think it's a little too long. The runtime is 161 minutes, and at a certain point you can kind of feel that, especially when you get probably like 2/3 of the way through the movie. But overall, I think this is a very enjoyable experience. I think this movie kind of flew under the radar when it came out because it came out pretty much a year after Wolf of Wall Street, and nobody was really talking about that in terms of it being a Scorsese movie. More people were talking about Wolf of Wall Street, of course. But I think this movie is definitely worth watching, especially for a good Andrew Garfield performance. Enemy, directed by Denis Villeneuve, starring Jake Gyllenhaal, is the story of this guy who kind of leads this sort of meek life as this university professor when he discovers that there is somebody out there who looks exactly like him, and the implications that that would bring of finding somebody who is basically your doppelganger. This movie is very metaphorical. It's one of the first movies that kind of put Denis Villeneuve on the map as far as being a director. I think this movie is very compelling. You really can't predict it in any sort of way. Like I said, it's very metaphorical and allegorical. There's a lot that can be interpreted from this, and definitely benefits from multiple viewings if you want to try to get the full perspective of it, which, you know, you might not even get from a second watch. Visually, this movie is very compelling. I thought that it really kind of reflects the style that Denis Villeneuve has sort of carried over into his movies that he's put out after this. That sort of long, almost droning shot of somebody from a faraway distance. This movie is based on a book that was written by Jose Saramago called The Double. And I'm actually reading a Saramago book right now called Blindness, which is pretty good. And I can definitely see how someone could gravitate towards his writing style and want to adapt it into a movie. Overall, I think Enemy's good. I don't think everybody's going to like it. I think this is a movie that can fly over a lot of people's heads if they're not really in the mood for something that's very symbolic, very metaphorical, like I said. But overall, I think it's worth watching, especially if you're a fan of Denis Villeneuve's filmmaking style. Unbreakable by M. Night Shyamalan stars Bruce Willis and is about this guy who has this superhuman strength and is sort of learning to cope with the implications that that would bring on his family and his everyday life. And I think this movie is a fairly interesting sort of deconstruction on the typical superhero narrative. It's a much more thought out, sort of methodical pace than a typical superhero movie would be. And I would even hesitate to even call this a superhero movie because it's more so just a straight drama film about the implications that having superpowers like these would bring to somebody's life. I think that Samuel L. Jackson is great in this movie, and I also think it's a good Bruce Willis performance, which has been long missing. I think this is definitely one of the better M. Night movies that I've seen in terms of quality, although I am really looking forward to hopefully watching Old one day and having a good hearty chuckle from it. And I have yet to really see Split or Glass. I heard that one was good, and then there's Glass. So yeah, really good M. Night movie. Cherish it while you can. Falling Down is a action drama film by Joel Schumacher that stars Michael Douglas and is about this man who is just kind of fed up with everything in his life, fed up with his ex-wife and the system that he finds himself in and the overall world that is surrounding him. He sort of feels disenfranchised with everything, and he kind of takes matters into his own hands. And while he sort of makes this path of destruction on his way back home, Robert Duvall plays a detective that is kind of hot on his trail. And this movie is very kind of reminiscent of the same sort of sentiment that Taxi Driver has. It's kind of about this almost psychotic dude who's just really fed up with everything around him, and he sort of becomes a vigilante of sorts, sort of takes matters into his own hands. I like that this movie differs from something like Taxi Driver because it gives you that second perspective from Robert Duvall's character, where he plays a cop that is looking for him and sort of trying to figure out why all this stuff is happening around him. I think it's one of those movies that isn't as good as those other types of movies where it sort of is a character study on somebody who just kind of has a mental break and quote unquote becomes their own man and takes matters into their own hands. I think that overall this movie is pretty good. I think that Robert Duvall's part is not as compelling as Michael Douglas's, mainly because his plot doesn't really seem to pick up as much until like halfway through the movie, and then once those things get going, it starts to become more investing. I think really Michael Douglas sort of carries this movie, and you can't help but watch him sort of come into that character and really embrace the insanity of it. Overall, I think this is a very well done movie that takes that sort of genre of a character study of somebody who just has a breakdown and does it pretty well. The House That Jack Built, directed by Lars von Trier, starring Matt Dillon, is about a serial killer who is kind of just going through the different points in his life that really had an impact on the decisions that he made and the overall person that he becomes. I think this being the only Lars von Trier movie that I've seen, I think that it was pretty well done for the most part. I haven't seen Antichrist or any other sort of movie that he's done. I've only watched this one from him. But I think overall it's pretty effective in portraying this sort of layered version of a serial killer and the different kind of stages in his life that he reaches, while also retaining the fact that he's a complete psychopath and is pretty irredeemable for the most part. I think really my favorite parts of this movie are the conversations he has with this character named Verge, and I'm not going to spoil it, I'm not going to give it away, but there are some deeper implications past the physical, I guess you could say, in this movie. I think that overall the narration and the back and forth between the two really makes this movie stand out. I think that that's easily the best part of it. Overall, I think that sometimes in this movie, certain scenes can feel a little too drawn out, specifically a scene involving him and the actress Riley Coe. I think that there are a good amount of scenes in this movie that could have been trimmed down, could have been a little more effective in terms of the time that it uses. But overall, I think this movie is pretty good. Of course, there's some controversy around it because it involves a subject matter that is a little sensitive, that being of serial killers, and obviously this movie's pretty violent. If you're averse to that sort of thing, definitely don't check it out. Some people could argue that it's sort of Lars von Trier being gratuitous and making a movie for shock value's sake, and I think that it's got a little more artistic merit there than some people give it credit for. And overall, I'm glad that I watched this. Pusher is the first movie that was made by Nicholas Winding Refn, and I mentioned Pusher 2 earlier. This is the movie that came before it. It's about a guy who is basically involved in the drug ring of Copenhagen and the sort of different avenues that he has to navigate and the situations that he finds himself in. I think for being a first feature movie, you kind of have to take into effect that Nicholas Winding Refn didn't have that big of a budget. Obviously, he had to use a lot of the same actors from this movie as he did his next movie, so you're not going to get as big of a production value as you would on something, say, like Drive or Bronson. But I think overall this movie is pretty good. It really embraces that documentary style where it just kind of is a shaky handheld cam that follows the characters and the footage looks very grainy. I think that overall it's a pretty simple, straightforward story about this guy who just keeps getting into more and more debt and becomes more and more desperate as the hole that he's in gets bigger and bigger. If you like that sort of gritty, kind of underground indie movie feel that something like this movie would bring, definitely check it out. Pusher 3, I Am the Angel of Death, is the third movie in the Pusher trilogy and follows the sort of mob crime boss that is present in both the first and the second movie, and he's the only character that's in all three of them, but this one specifically focuses on him. I think overall this movie is sort of on par with the first one in terms of my overall enjoyment. I think that as a character, I don't find him as compelling as something like Mads Mikkelsen or the main character from the first movie, but I still found it fairly interesting, and I was very curious as to where it was going the entire time because this movie does take place after the events of the first two. And I think it's an interesting choice to kind of focus on this character and sort of the personal side to him while also acknowledging the fact that he's not really the best dude in the world. Overall, in terms of quality, it's almost the exact same as the second movie. Obviously, the production value is higher than the first one. It's a little more stylistic. It really kind of refines that sort of documentary style. And overall, if you want the full Pusher experience, I definitely don't suggest skipping this one. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is a MCU movie directed by Destin Daniel Cretton. What a name that is. And is about a character named Shang-Chi who kind of runs away from his homeland and really tries to get away from all the mythical stuff that he was surrounded in growing up and the kind of combat lifestyle that he was used to, and sort of tries to make a life for himself, but then all that stuff kind of comes back and starts to haunt him, and he has to go confront different elements of his past. Overall, I think this is one of the better Marvel movies that I've seen. I think that the action in this movie is the best part about it, at least in the first 2/3 of it. I think that the martial arts is really well done, and I think that the music that accompanies it and the way that it's shot really complements it very well. I really like the relationship dynamic between Shang-Chi and Katie, his friend in the movie. I like the fact that they really embrace that really strong friendship of it without trying to force this kind of romantic angle of it. At least that's what it implies in the first 90% of the movie. It kind of starts to head in a direction towards the end that I would have been okay if it didn't do that. And I also think another complaint that I have with this movie is towards the end it kind of becomes this standard kind of big stakes Marvel movie where everyone's flying around and there's all these different mythical creatures and dragons appearing and stuff like that, and it just kind of becomes this otherworldly thing that the Marvel movies are really known for. And I like the fact that in the first 2/3 it sort of stood on its own and really embraced that grounded martial arts style that it was pushing for. But overall, I think this movie is really good. I think that, like I said, it is one of the top Marvel movies for me, and I think overall it's just a breath of fresh air in the kind of superhero fatigue that some people might be experiencing. Manhunter, directed by Michael Mann, is kind of the story that comes before Silence of the Lambs. It's inspired by the Red Dragon novel by Thomas Harris and is about the character of Will Graham trying to find a serial killer by the name of the Tooth Fairy, and to do so he has to enlist the help of Hannibal Lecter, who he had an encounter with in the past and sort of led him to not want to be a cop anymore, but then he gets pulled back into it looking for this new serial killer. Overall, I thought this movie was surprisingly good. I thought that despite Anthony Hopkins not playing Hannibal Lecter. I thought Brian Cox did a pretty decent job. Obviously, it's not as iconic of a portrayal as something like Anthony Hopkins did in the next movie, but I think that Will Graham served as an okay character. I didn't think that he was anything too special. I didn't think that his character was as effectively portrayed as somebody like the Tooth Fairy in the movie, who was very compelling, and you can easily find yourself wrapped up in the reasons for why he does the things that he does and sort of his story that you follow along when he's introduced. I think my favorite part of this movie is the way that it's shot. I think that it sort of really embraces that kind of 80s style while also really getting that specific kind of lighting that you would want from a movie like this. It's sort of this almost comfortable, like cozy, like you just woke up in the morning and it's really cloudy outside, but it's still kind of like blue and it's shining through the window and you can sort of half see things but not really, and you're kind of in a dreamy like state. That's how I would describe how this movie is shot and the music in it. It's almost kind of like a dream in a way. And I really like the poster of this movie. I think the poster is very striking, and the minimal use of colors in it is really well done. Just a commentary on the marketing of the movie. Overall, I think this movie's decent. I don't think it reaches quite the heights that something like Silence of the Lambs does, but I think that in terms of it being its own movie, I think it's very underlooked and should be given another chance if you're a fan of the world that this is entrenched in. Chopper by Andrew Dominik, starring Eric Bana, is an Australian crime movie about Mark Chopper Reed, who is a real figure in Australia, who is a pretty notorious criminal who only really goes after the bad guys. This movie reminded me a lot of Bronson in that it's a very stylistic look at somebody who is a notorious criminal who's known throughout the country that he's in, but not necessarily the world, and really puts you into his own perspective and kind of gives you a glimpse at his line of thinking for the actions that he takes. Overall, I thought this movie was pretty compelling. The only other Andrew Dominik movie that I've seen is Killing Them Softly, which I wasn't a huge fan of. I think that when it really does kind of embrace that gritty sort of criminal nature of it all and entrenches itself in that grime of the world that Chopper finds himself in, I think that this movie is at its best. I think overall it's just a very good look at this personality and this larger than life guy who is really kind of a nasty dude, but you can't help but feel some kind of sympathy for him in a way. Overall, this movie did remind me a lot of Bronson, even though this came out before Bronson, and it's very hard to find, so if this sounds like something that's up your alley, check it out. Dune 2021, also directed by Denis Villeneuve, starring Timothée Chalamet and a bunch of other people, is a science fiction story based on Frank Herbert's novel that came out in 1961, I think, and is about this son of the Duke for House Atreides named Paul Atreides, who is his family has to go become basically the, for lack of a better word, ministers of this planet called Arrakis, where the Space Guild extracts this spice that allows them to travel throughout space and time. It's a very important resource, I'll just say that. And it's about following Paul and the implications that sort of forcing a messiah to come about would bring on the society that is entrenched in this sort of thing. I think that overall this movie was really good and a really faithful adaptation to what the book was going for. This is one of the most interesting movies I think that I saw this year, just solely due to the fact that it was part one of a second part thing, but they weren't sure if they were going to make the second movie because it was very dependent on how this movie did financially. And I think that rating it is kind of a tough endeavor because it's not a complete story, really. I mean, without spoiling anything too much. But I think that after it was been confirmed that they were going to make a second movie and that they currently are making one right now, I think that takes sort of the uncertain weight that people had with getting involved in this movie. Overall, I think this is one of the most gorgeous movies I've seen. I think that Denis Villeneuve always kills it in terms of the cinematography of his movies. I think that is just visually stunning, and I think that the effects are close to perfect, if I'll be honest. Like, I don't remember really any instance of a bad piece of CGI. And I think that this is one of those movies that's going to age very well. Obviously, I am a huge fan of Blade Runner 2049, and I think that movie is just a step better than this one. But then again, Blade Runner 2049 is a complete story in of itself, whereas this one is heavily reliant on the fact that there's a movie coming out that's being made that we don't know the full story of yet, unless you've read the books, of course. Overall, I think the acting in this movie is really good for the most part. I think that there might have been a couple weak points, like there are some instances where it was sort of hard to believe Timothy Chalamet was struggling as much as he was, but then there were some scenes where he really nailed it. I think that Jason Momoa as Duncan Idaho is a really fun character, and I really liked Stellan Skarsgård as the Baron. I think that he, for the few times that he was on screen, was the most compelling part as far as characters go in this movie. You know, Dave Bautista was good. I think that it's hard to see him in a movie and not see Drax, especially when he's also gray in this movie. But overall, I'm really excited to watch the second one whenever that comes out and really see where the story goes from here. So yeah, 8 out of 10. Bone Tomahawk is a 2015 horror western film by S. Craig Zahler that stars Kurt Russell, Patrick Wilson, Matthew Fox, Richard Jenkins, and a few other people, and is essentially a rescue mission story about these 4 guys who have to go out into the desert and fight these, they call them troglodytes. They're basically a Native American tribe that is cannibalistic and kidnaps and eats people. And this movie is stylistically is very well done. I really like the way that this movie's shot. I think that the cinematography is really on par with S. Craig Zahler's other 2 movies, that being Brawl in Cell Block 99 and Dragged Across Concrete. I think overall this movie has a tone that is really good for the first 80% of it. I think that it's sort of this methodical, droning journey that these guys are on, where they're struggling basically the entire time, and you can really feel the weight of that struggle when you watch them walk through the woods and the desert, and you feel the weight of that journey follow them almost the entire time. The last 20% of this movie kind of becomes a little too unrealistic for me, if I'll just use that word. It sort of takes the weight that the first 80% of it had and kind of lifts it up and makes it way lighter than it was before. Not to say that the last 20% of the movie isn't compelling or fun, because it definitely is, but I think that overall it was weaker than what came before it, which makes me not like this movie as much as something like Brawl in Cell Block or Dragged Across Concrete. With the way that the characters speak and the way that the dialogue's written, you can kind of tell that S. Craig Zahler is somebody who writes his scripts in a very novelistic way. The characters carry over these traits and these sayings and these phrases throughout the entire thing, very much akin to the dialogue in the other 2 films that I mentioned before. And it's a pretty compelling and entertaining way to portray these characters and to have them sort of have these established yet kind of subtle personalities that just poke through at the right moments. Overall, I really like this movie. I think that I'm going to look forward to watching it again. And also, of course, there is an infamous scene in this movie that I'm not going to spoil. I'm not even going to tell you when it happens. You'll just know when it happens. Dr. Sleep is sort of a sequel to The Shining that came out in 2019, directed by Mike Flanagan, starring Ewan McGregor as Danny Torrance, and sort of follows his character as he struggles with the implications of the events of the first movie and what it means to have this ability called The Shining. Overall, as far as spiritual successors go, I think this is one of the better ones that I've seen. I really like the way that this movie's shot. I think that visually it's a very compelling movie, especially in a certain amount of dream sequences that it has. I think that Rebecca Ferguson plays a compelling villain character. I think that she really drives the plot forward in a way that is very compelling to watch. And I think that Ewan McGregor in almost every movie that he's in is very captivating to watch, and it's fun to watch him play this character who's going through this really heavy internal struggle and dealing with the traumatic events of the first movie. Obviously, I don't think this movie is as good as The Shining. Obviously, it's kind of hard to measure up to those expectations that Kubrick set, but I think that if they were going to make a sequel for that movie that's based on a sequel book that Stephen King wrote, I think that this movie is as good as you could probably get. I do think that some of the pacing is a little bit of a problem. I think that in some parts it can feel a little too long and a little too dragged out, but overall I think that this movie has a purpose. I think that it has a message to convey and sort of offers a view of what the characters are going through 30 years basically after what happens in the first movie. So yeah, I really like this movie. Anomalisa is an animated movie that is written and directed by Charlie Kaufman and is about this guy who's voiced by David Thewlis, who is basically a motivational speaker for customer service and has to fly out to somewhere to give a speech. And the whole movie is about his struggle with the fact that he basically hears everybody as the same voice, who's voiced by Tom Noonan, even the women and the children. And I think that it's a very interesting premise to sort of look at and kind of portray, especially in an animated film. This is definitely not an animated film that's meant for kids. Obviously, it's a Charlie Kaufman movie and it touches on very adult themes. But the fact that it is animated sort of adds that layer to the story that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise if it were a live action movie. I think that overall it's a touching portrayal of somebody who really can't find the right way to connect to somebody that he would like to, and sort of is about the loneliness that somebody feels when they see everybody else as the same person. I think that the voice acting, all three voice actors in this movie do a really good job, and I think that overall it's a really intimate look at this person's life and their struggle that they have, only clocking in at 90 minutes. Me personally, I like movies like Eternal Sunshine, I'm Thinking of Ending Things, Adaptation a little bit better than this one, I think. But overall, this is definitely not a bad movie in any stretch of the word. It is a great movie that I think more people need to check out. If you like Charlie Kaufman and you like that sort of writing style that he has, definitely watch this movie. I would say that it's one of the more straightforward movies that he has, even though it's animated, which is kind of surprising. We need to talk about Kevin, directed by Lynn Ramsey, starring Tilda Swinton and Ezra Miller as this mother who gives birth to this child, and this child basically grows up to become kind of a psychopath who has like no emotionally redeeming qualities almost whatsoever. And it kind of portrays that struggle of that mother-son relationship of a mother who you really find it impossible for her to love her son the way that she should. And you kind of understand why when you watch this movie. I think that overall this movie's good. I think that it cinematically is very stunning and very well done. I think that this movie is definitely more so about Tilda Swinton as a character struggling with the aftermaths of the events that happen in this movie, and also before the events that kind of occur at the climax of this movie. You get to witness like both of those sides for almost the same amount of time. I kind of found it hard to take John C. Reilly as the dad a little seriously. Obviously, he's more known for his comedic portrayals in movies that usually star Will Smith as like this some sort of man-child, but here you kind of are forced to take him seriously, and it's a little difficult at times to do so, especially when he plays a character that's sort of a bumbling idiot. I just think that his inclusion kind of took away from the seriousness and the heaviness of this movie in certain ways, and was probably the weakest part of it in my opinion. I also think that some of the situations that Tilda Swinton found herself in was a little unrealistic, especially for the implications of what happens in this movie, and I'm not going to go into spoilers, but just know that the gripes are there, I guess. But overall, I thought this was a decent movie, a very well acted movie. I thought Ezra Miller was probably the best part as far as acting goes. I thought he portrayed this sort of psychopathic teenager very well. So yeah, pretty good. I had it at a 7, but I bumped it up to an 8 after giving it some time. Into the Wild is a biographical adventure film that stars Emile Hirsch and is directed by Sean Penn, and is an adaptation of a book of the same title that's written by John Krakauer, who, if you don't know, also wrote the book about Mount Everest and the climbers that died up there into thin air. I really like this movie visually. I think that it is very compelling for the most part. You follow this guy's journey on just going into the world on his own for the first time in his life and kind of taking it by the reins in his mission to live in the wild, basically by himself. Meanwhile, you get these different perspectives of like members of his family who are looking for him and wondering where exactly he went to. Overall, I thought this movie was fine. I thought that it was okay for the most part. I think the biggest thing that I had as far as the complaint goes would be the writing. As an example, there's a scene in this movie where the character Chris McCandless, who is a real person in real life that's being played by an actor in this movie, is talking about this apple and how like it's natural and organic and blah blah, and it kind of comes across as sort of pretentious in a way. And I don't know if the person in real life was like this or not, but I think translating it to screen, it didn't work quite as well. I think that there are certain points in this movie that work better than others. I think that when he is just on his own kind of struggling and you get that really intimate sort of view at what his situation was at the time, I think that's when the movie's at its best. I think that when he is around other people and sort of kind of staying with others throughout a long period of time, I think that's when the movie is at its weakest point. Overall, I think this movie could have benefited from focusing more on him and only him in kind of like this really intimate way that you don't get for a lot of scenes in this movie. But overall, I thought the movie was good. I thought the acting was decent for the most part. And if you like adventure movies, it's hard to say no to this one. The Neon Demon, directed by Nicholas Winding Refn, starring Elle Fanning, or however you pronounce it, is about this model who moves to LA and kind of tries to make it big for herself, tries to make a name for herself. And the movie is kind of about this transformation of character from somebody who's really humble to somebody who starts to realize that she is as beautiful as everybody tells her, and kind of makes you look at the inward person that kind of comes about when somebody is praised to the point of becoming narcissistic. Overall, I really like this movie for the first 75% of it. And without going into spoilers, I was kind of disappointed in the way this movie ended. It just kind of felt like Nicholas Winding Refn couldn't help himself in the way that he wrapped this movie up. And I think that just the story that it was following with her character and the kind of low stakes sort of situations that she found herself in the world of modeling was compelling in of itself. And then Nicholas Winding Refn throws these elements in that try to force this heavier implication of these higher stakes that just don't work for me, and it kind of just feels out of left field and out of nowhere, and it really kind of hits you in the face, splashes you with cold water in a not good way. I think that the ending of this movie kind of sabotages what it sets up and what it builds up to, and almost feels like a subversion of expectations just for the sake of subverting expectations. Nevertheless, despite my gripes with this, I think that this is one of the most gorgeous Nicholas Winding Refn movies that I've seen. Visually, it's like one of the most stunning movies ever. And I really didn't have a problem with the pacing in this movie as much as I did with a movie like Bronson or, God forbids, Only God Forgives. Overall, I think it's towards the better end of Nicholas Winding Refn movies, even if he does indulge himself too much at the end. And if you've seen this movie, you'll know what I'm talking about. So yeah, I would say it's worth a watch overall, despite my issues. Calvary is a 2014 Irish drama movie starring Brendan Gleeson and is about this pastor who basically goes around trying to solve other people's problems in this small town in Ireland that he lives in, whether they want him to or not. And it sort of follows this really personal journey that he has with the implications of his daughter coming back and kind of confronting things that he did or didn't do in the past for her. I think that definitely Brendan Gleeson is the best part. I think that the movie benefits from following him solely, and it kind of has this almost mystery element to it that you kind of forget about after a certain point in the movie, because it introduces that element at the beginning, which I won't go into too much detail about because I don't want to spoil it. And then it sort of kind of puts it in the back seat the further it goes in, to the point where you almost forget that it's there, and then it really kind of comes back at the end. And I think that if it didn't have that element in the movie, I would have liked this movie better. I really like the intimate look at him as a character, at him as being this sort of preacher who the other characters feel as if he's way too judgmental, and whether or not he is or not, that's kind of up for the audience to decide. You know, it's kind of based on that sort of personal look and that kind of subjective viewpoint that somebody might have in watching this movie, whether or not he is too morally superior to the other characters or not. Like I said, I think the acting for the most part in this movie is good. I think that some of the character portrayals came across as a little goofy with a few certain characters, and I'm not going to go into spoilers, but some characters felt almost a little too caricature-y for me. Caricature-y? Is that a word? It is now. But overall, I think this movie is pretty good. I think stylistically it is really compelling. There are some visual effects in this movie that really don't look good, and I can't explain what they are without spoiling the hell out of this movie. So watch this movie. It's worth watching, but when you get to that part, you'll know what I'm talking about. The Killing of a Sacred Deer by Yorgos Lanthimos stars Colin Farrell and is about this surgeon who has this interesting relationship with this young boy whose father was a patient of his, and it kind of gets into this sort of supernatural realm where basically his family is cursed and he has to make a decision that will change the family's life forever, basically. Stylistically, this movie is very unique. It is very different from a lot of the movies I've seen this past year. I really like the way that it's shot. I really like the music that accompanies this movie. I think that it is the best part of the movie on a technical level. Just how visually and musically engrossing this movie is. It really kind of pushes that creepy, unsettling atmosphere that you get. People call this movie a horror movie. I don't know if I would go as far as to say that exactly. I would say it's more of a psychological thriller, magical realism movie. I think the biggest issue I had with this is the writing, the characters specifically. They all kind of feel like these almost wooden figures who really kind of accept their fate at face value and don't display that many range of emotions at all, especially Nicole Kidman's character, who I had a big issue with in this movie. I think that there's a few instances of this sort of sense of false foreshadowing that happens in this movie that leads to something that doesn't pay off really at all. I think this movie could have ended in a different, much better way that would have made more sense for the characters in the movie and the situations and the actions that they took. But overall, this being the only Yorgos Lanthimos movie I've seen, I really enjoyed it for the most part. I think that stylistically it was one of the better movies I've seen. And I think the title's really good, The Killing of a Sacred Deer. That is it's a pretty banging title. Under the Silver Lake, directed by David Robert Mitchell, is an A24 movie that stars Andrew Garfield and is about this young guy who's in his late 20s, early 30s, who lives in LA and is really disenfranchised with the environment around him, who basically stumbles on this conspiracy when he finds out that his attractive neighbor that he had a connection with suddenly disappears. And the whole movie is just kind of him trying to unravel this mystery and to what is happening in the LA area. This movie is one of those movies that definitely benefits from rewatches. I think that there are going to be things that you definitely will miss the first time watching. There are so many hidden small little details that are just constantly being thrown your way, which is a positive and also can be a negative for this movie. I think that there is so much stuff going on. There is a lot that's jam-packed into this movie that it almost risks becoming pointless in a way. Like you're watching this movie and you can't help but feel like, what is this leading up to? What is this building up to? What's the purpose of everything that's going on here? And when you get to the end, you are still kind of left with those questions of what did it all mean? What's the point of this movie? And I think that as a risk, it can kind of turn a lot of people off from this movie. But if you're somebody who really loves the mystery and the conspiracy around certain things and the way that different elements of pop culture and references connect to bigger implications, then I think that you'll really enjoy this movie. I think that visually it's very compelling. There were some shots in this movie that I just couldn't help but feel like they were really well done. As far as A24 movies go, I think that it's kind of towards the bottom of my list, but as far as it being a movie in of itself, I think that it's definitely worth checking out. Constantine, directed by Francis Lawrence, starring Keanu Reeves, is about this guy named John Constantine who basically sends demons back to hell after they come to Earth, and he has to do his best to try to rescue this girl that is trapped in hell, basically. This movie is very goofy. It's very kind of tongue-in-cheek, sort of comic book movie, and Wikipedia even titles it a superhero horror film, which I think kind of describes it pretty well. Overall, I think that the biggest thing this movie has for it is tone. I think that it has a very consistent tone throughout the entire thing, and I think the fact that it commits so heavily to it is the best part of it. I think also Keanu Reeves is very compelling to watch as this character. He really benefits from playing somebody who is like a gritty kind of doesn't give a shit kind of dude who is just sort of done with everything around him. Like I said, overall, this movie's very cheesy. It's not a movie that anybody should really take seriously, but it is also a really fun movie at the same time. I think that some of the characters can come across as pretty goofy and almost are on the verge of being a little too cartoonish at some points, especially Tilda Swinton's character of Gabriel. I think when you watch this movie, you kind of know what you're getting, and it's definitely not the best movie that's ever been made, but it's one of the most fun ones I've seen this past year, and it definitely has points in it that are very memorable and performances that are really kind of stand out. For example, Peter Stormare as Lucifer is probably the best part of the movie as far as acting goes. I was just really compelled anytime he was on screen. So yeah, if you love Keanu Reeves like I do, and you love a fun sort of roller coaster of a movie, then this is definitely one to check out. A Quiet Place Part 2 with John Krasinski, also directed by John Krasinski, and he's in it too, and it's a film. This movie was pretty good overall. I thought it was decent. I thought it was a good sequel for the most part. I didn't think it was as good as the first one. I didn't think it was as tight. To me, kind of like the mystery of where the monsters came from and what they were. Revealing that information sort of takes away from that kind of almost uncertainty about them, I guess. I thought that the performances in this movie were good, specifically from the daughter who's deaf. I thought she is like the best performance in the movie, and I also thought that Cillian Murphy was a good addition to the series, I guess, because, you know, I guarantee you they're going to make a third. But I thought he did a really good job. I thought he kind of like played a good kind of alternate to John Krasinski's character in the movie. Not to give anything away, but he is kind of like the star of this movie. He really kind of carries it on his back, and it works well for the most part, I would say. A pretty big criticism I have for this movie is it definitely just feels like a second part. You know, what I mean by that is, when it comes to like trilogies of movies or like a series of movies, I always feel like the second one is definitely the weakest out of every one of them. For example, I love the John Wick movies. I think the second one is probably the weakest out of the three. And it kind of falls into that trap of like, it feels like a lot of the same from the first one, and it can kind of feel a little bit old at certain points. You know, some of the danger in this movie is very reflective of what happens in the movie that came before it, but I thought it was pretty okay. If you like the first one and you're a big fan of it, you'll probably like this one too. The Cable Guy is a comedy movie starring Jim Carrey and Matthew Broderick, and is basically about a deranged cable installing man played by Jim Carrey, who basically forces his friendship upon Matthew Broderick, and when Matthew Broderick doesn't want to reciprocate, things go a little kooky. I was very curious to see this movie because I've seen bits and pieces of it, but it's kind of one of the only Jim Carrey movies that he's known for being Jim Carrey in that I haven't really checked out. I've seen a lot of people online say that this is a good movie, and for the most part, I enjoyed watching this. I said this before, but I'll say it again. It's kind of difficult for me to get into comedy movies, especially when I'm watching them by myself. So watching this, I wasn't really expecting too much laughs, I guess. You know, not a whole lot of hearty chuckles, although there were some moments that were just so batshit crazy that they kind of caught me off guard, like the basketball scene. I thought that was probably my favorite scene in the movie. I think that, you know, as far as performances goes, Jim Carrey is Jim Carrey. You know, take that how you will. I think that this movie is overall a decent film. It's not too different from the typical Jim Carrey comedies that he's known for. It is interesting to see him play like kind of a villain character, but at the same time, you can't help but feel sympathetic for him because at the end of the day, he's just this really lonely dude who has a hard time making friends. Thought Matthew Broderick was fine. I thought it was okay. You know, it's a typical comedy. It's shot like a comedy. Nothing too zany going on with the cinematography or the way that it's shot or visualized or anything. Overall, I thought this movie was good. Do I ever need to watch it again? Probably not. Escape from New York is a science fiction action film that stars Kurt Russell and is directed by John Carpenter and is about this huge city prison that is basically Manhattan has become, and there's giant walls and nobody can get in, nobody gets out, and it's basically where they dump all the prisoners in kind of like this neo-futuristic cyberpunk look at the United States. And then the president's plane gets shot down over the city, this prison city, and Kurt Russell, who is a convict, is tasked with going in and rescuing him, kind of against his will. I thought this movie was pretty fun. I thought it was entertaining. It is definitely a movie that's a product of the 80s. You know, this movie came out in 1981, so you get a heavy indication that this is an older movie. There are some things that really impressed me, like I really like the atmosphere that it set up. It really embraced that sort of cyberpunk, desolate apocalypse vibe that kind of reminded me of Mad Max a little bit, except it's set in a city and not a desert. Thought that Kurt Russell was great in this film. He plays a good kind of mercenary, hard-ass convict dude who wears an eye patch, and his name is Snake. I thought that was pretty interesting. And even though at certain points his voice and the way that he speaks is a little cheesy, a little tongue-in-cheek, but I kind of just embraced that with the campiness of this movie. I thought his performance was good, but I thought some of the other performances were a little too almost on the nose and a little too bombastic, I guess you could say. You know, like I said, a lot of the characters really are just so expressive to the point where it almost becomes comical sometimes, and it kind of goes against that sort of atmospheric setup that it sets for itself. And I know this movie is kind of supposed to be campy in a way, but I just can't help but feel that that's a deterrent for me. And of course, overall, I think the music's good. It's definitely 80s music, that's for sure. That John Carpenter, he loves his 80s. Thought it was a pretty decent movie overall, if not maybe a little bit forgettable and a little too campy sometimes, but what are you gonna do? Manchester by the Sea, directed by Kenneth Lonergan, starring Casey Affleck, Michelle Williams, Kyle Chandler, and Lucas Hedges, is about this guy who is played by Casey Affleck, who you can tell has kind of a troubled past, and he has to confront the fact that he is now the legal guardian of his nephew after something happens with his brother. And I thought this movie was good. I thought it was decent. A lot of people really praise this movie. I think the best part about it is the acting. I think that the acting, especially from Casey Affleck, is really good. Like some of the best that I've seen. And overall, I really like the tone of it. I like the kind of snowy, almost bleak but still kind of bright environment that the characters are in, you know, that kind of like New England sort of harbor area. I'm really kind of a sucker for that sort of aesthetic. Like I said, I thought Casey Affleck's acting was really good. I'm not a huge fan of Lucas Hedges. I thought his character was kind of annoying, but I guess that was sort of the point. But for me, it was just not something that I cared about too much. And this movie deals with the subject of grief and how different people process it and how different people go about confronting a traumatic experience such as a loved one dying suddenly. And there are points in this movie where the characters definitely like sort of confront those things and they're entrenched in those emotions, but for a lot of this movie, I thought it was kind of afraid to get really intimate with that kind of emotion that it kept teasing us with and that we'd never really kind of get. The characters, of course, you're supposed to look at them and see, oh, they're going about this grief process in different ways, and sometimes those different ways that they go about it kind of conflict with each other, and you kind of get to see the tension between Casey Affleck and Lucas Hedges' character in a few different instances. But I wish this movie had at least like one or two scenes to where it really confronted the, I guess, elephant in the room, for lack of a better word, and didn't really leave us hanging like it does. But overall, I thought this movie was fine. I thought it was good. Maybe the pacing's a little slow too, but that's just the kind of movie that it is, I think, so I'm not going to necessarily take too many points away from it. But overall, I thought it was decent, a good movie that I don't know if I ever need to watch again. The French Dispatch by Wes Anderson, with a huge ensemble cast, of course, because it's Wes Anderson, is sort of a anthology tale, with the reoccurring story being that of a newspaper that is going under because their founder passed away, I guess you could say, like the editor-in-chief. And with that being the case, they are only making one more issue, and the stories that play out in the movie are parts of the stories in the issue of the final magazine. Of course, this is a Wes Anderson movie, so visually this movie is gorgeous. It looks stunning. It uses a lot of black and white, but when it does embrace the color scheme, it really shines through, and I really like the way that this movie looks as far as color and visualization goes. Of course, Wes Anderson's cinematography is so unique and auteur that you can't help but marvel at the things that he creates and the set pieces that he designs and the way that the camera is framed. So that would probably be my favorite aspect of the movie. A big complaint that I have with this movie and a few other Wes Anderson movies is that the writing style can kind of feel a little samey for a lot of the characters. And what I mean by this is that when you watch a Wes Anderson movie, especially one like this, or Royal Tenenbaums, or Life Aquatic, which I'll get into later, it can feel like a lot of the characters are just written by Wes Anderson and not necessarily characters in of themselves. A lot of their personalities are kind of the same. You know, everyone's got that sort of dry, quick, quippy, witty humor about them that Wes Anderson's kind of known for. And I get that a lot of people really like that. For me, it can get kind of stale, especially in a movie where the stories are broken up such as they are. And that's not to say that every single character feels the same. I really like Adrian Brody's character in the prison painter story, and I like the police chef story as well at the end. I thought the Timothée Chalamet story was probably the weakest part of the movie. To me, that one was kind of the most forgettable. There were certain points in this movie where it felt like Wes Anderson was just trying something and seeing if it would work for a decent portion of the movie. For example, there's a part in the last story that is an animated sequence that lasts for about 5 minutes or so. And it's entertaining, but it just kind of comes out of nowhere and doesn't really fit with the rest of what the movie's going for. And you can't help but feel that Wes Anderson just said to himself, hey, I just want to try this thing real quick. We'll just use this movie to test it out and see if people like it. And while the animation is good and while I thought that it was well done, it really wasn't too fitting with how the rest of the movie was. It just kind of felt out of left field a little bit, which, I mean, I get some people might like. I just wasn't too keen on it, I guess. But overall, I thought this movie was decent. Wes Anderson, I don't think, has made too bad of a movie yet, although I haven't seen a lot of his earlier stuff, like Bottle Rocket or Rushmore, so I guess that's yet to be determined. So yeah, if you like Wes Anderson, you're probably going to like this one. I enjoyed it for the most part. Do I need to see it again? No. Did it make me want to watch Grand Budapest? Yeah. Beautiful Boy, another Timothée Chalamet movie, here we go, is directed by Felix van Groningen. I'm sorry, Felix. And is about this father-son relationship that's kind of being torn apart and in a huge struggle because the son is addicted to drugs. And the whole movie's kind of just showcasing that sort of relationship struggle between Steve Carell as the dad and Timothée Chalamet as the son. I thought this movie was good. I thought it was a good look at sort of this struggle between this father and son and their relationship kind of tearing at the seams because of the son's drug problems. I thought that Timothée Chalamet was pretty good in this film. I think it's one of my favorite performances from him. And I didn't think that Steve Carell was as good in this movie as he's been in other films. Like, he's really good in The Big Short, and in this movie he kind of just feels like a really tired Steve Carell. And I think that the way that the story is portrayed and the way that the script plays out, I don't think it does him any favors, because a lot of the time it just goes from just the different points in Timothée Chalamet's life where he just keeps going back to drugs, and you never really kind of get the sense that he has a life outside of those instances. You know, you never really get to see the kind of everyday sort of normal day from his perspective or his dad's perspective. I would have liked a little more different types of scenes, because sometimes this movie can feel a little repetitive with the way that the scenes play out. Like I said, it's just kind of like a bunch of back and forth of Timothée Chalamet going, oh, I'm sorry, Dad, I'm using drugs, and Steve Carell is going, you can't keep doing this, son. And it can kind of feel a little samey after a while. I like using the word samey lately. Samey. Samey is becoming samey. But overall, I thought this movie was decent. I thought that the performance from Timothée Chalamet was good. I thought visually the movie looked pretty compelling. And I really enjoyed the music in this movie, too. I thought the use of the music was really well done. Riders of Justice is a Danish action comedy film starring Mads Mikkelsen and is about a tragic event that takes place with a train accident and the different implications of fate and the sort of statistical chances of something like that happening and the events leading up to it. And it's kind of about Mads Mikkelsen and his group of nerd friends kind of going around trying to figure out what exactly happened with this train accident that may or may not involve this biker gang called the Riders of Justice. This movie is an action comedy in the fullest sense of the term, and there are a lot of scenes that have this sort of like kind of black comedy tone to it. And for me personally, I think it works for the most part. Of course, there are some scenes where it just kind of feels like, well, that's a little weird for the sake of being weird. Why they do that? And it just doesn't work sometimes, but I'd say for the most part, it kind of fits the tone of this movie's going for. You know, it touches on a whole different kinds of subjects such as grief and regret and the sort of emotional closing up of Mads Mikkelsen's character and him not willing to open up to anybody and sort of finding a new sense of family with the people that he meets because of this event. I think that for the first like 60% of this movie, I really enjoyed it. Kind of towards the end, it sort of feels like it kind of abandons that sort of morally gray, gritty sort of search that they embark on, and it just kind of brings the conflict to them. And sometimes it feels a little too convenient, and I'm not going to go into spoilers or anything specific to give anything away, but if you watch the movie, it definitely becomes clear that there's a shift in the sort of way that the story plays out. And I wasn't too keen on it, I guess. And like I said, some of the humor is a little like, what the fuck? I think Mads Mikkelsen, of course, is great in everything that he's in. I thought, of course, he was the best part of this movie. And he plays a really good, kind of hard-ass, emotionally stunted character who has such a hard time opening up, and you can tell that there's something further beneath the surface that just kind of want to breaks free, but he's just so emotionally stunted that he just won't let it. And of course, I thought some of the other characters were good too. I wasn't a huge fan of the character of Emmentaler. I thought he was a little too cartoony and a little too unrealistic for my liking. But overall, this movie's pretty good. Shout out to Mads Mikkelsen's Christmas sweater. If you've seen the movie, you'll know what I'm talking about. Last Night in Soho, directed by Edgar Wright, starring Thomasin McKenzie, is about this girl who goes off to school to become a fashion designer and moves to London. And the movie is sort of about her trying to kind of find her place in the world and where she fits in. You know, she's somebody whose personality doesn't really gel with a lot of people around her, and she kind of finds herself alienated in some instances. Suddenly she comes across this sort of otherworldly element where she enters into the kind of 1950s and sort of gets a view of somebody else's life, and she takes that inspiration and puts it into her fashion for her school. I think my favorite part of this movie is Thomasin McKenzie's performance. I think she's one of my favorite up-and-coming actresses. I really liked her in Jojo Rabbit, and I think that her performance in this movie was really compelling, and you really get the sense that somebody is just mentally deteriorating throughout the story and just descending into this spiral that she can't really get out of. And I don't think that there was a bad performance in this movie, any sense of the word, really. The main issue I had with this was the story. It starts out really compelling, and the descent into madness element is a really interesting topic to explore. You know, I'm a fan of that sort of exploration in the plot. The thing that kind of goes downhill for me is when it gets towards the end and you kind of find out something about one of the characters that is this big revelation, and it kind of detracts from the experience of it a little bit, and the way that it plays out is kind of clunky and sort of mishandled. I definitely think that this is one of the weaker Edgar Wright movies that I've seen. I'm a big fan of Hot Fuzz and Baby Driver, and overall I thought that this movie could have been better. I was a little disappointed with the way that it played out, but there are some decent elements to it. Vampire's Kiss, directed by Robert Bierman, starring Nicolas Cage, is about this guy who is kind of like this businessman who's really eccentric and starts to convince himself that he's turning into a vampire, and the sort of wacky connotations that come with that. This is definitely a Nicolas Cage meme movie. It's one of those movies that if you've seen any sort of meme from Nicolas Cage, there's a 70% chance that it was from this movie. This movie is just sort of him having an excuse to kind of go wild and crazy and kick a bunch of shit and yell at people and be really bombastic throughout the whole thing. And that's probably the biggest thing that this movie has going for it, is just the unabashed way Nicolas Cage's performance just plays out. He really gives it his all. You know, there's a scene where I won't go too much into spoilers, but there's a great scene where he just hops on a desk and yells, "There you are!" And it's one of my favorite scenes in the movie. It just he's so brazen and just in your face the entire time, and I really enjoyed that. Aside from that, I think that that's really the only thing that this movie has going for it, is Nicolas Cage's performance. I thought that the other aspects of it were kind of lackluster. Anytime that it introduced the vampire element from the woman who he thinks he's becoming a vampire from, I thought that those were the weakest parts of the movie. It definitely kind of suffers a little bit as far as pacing goes, because it goes from scenes of Nicolas Cage going batshit crazy and yelling at people to scenes where he's just kind of laying in bed and this woman's talking to him and he's just kind of like, "Oh, I'm turning into a vampire." And it just kind of halts the sort of pace of the movie, you know, that kind of momentum that it builds up for itself. And it does that so often that I kind of have to detract points from this movie. But I guess if you want a good Nicolas Cage meme performance where he's just the purest form of Nicolas Cage, you cannot go with another movie. This is definitely the one to check out. Don't Look Up, directed by Adam McKay, and stars Leonardo DiCaprio, Jennifer Lawrence, blah, blah, blah. Medea's in this movie, too. Yeah, is a story about these astronomers who discover that a comet is on its way to destroy Earth in 6 months, and the kind of struggle that those two characters, Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence, have to go through in order to convince the world that everybody's going to die. This is definitely a satirical movie. It's definitely made as far as like kind of a political commentary on the sort of current state of the world. You know, they kind of poke fun at a lot of different elements, such as the news media and Trump and all these different sort of political elements. A jaded kind of society that only cares about entertainment and the celebrities that are engrossed in those sorts of things. I thought this movie was fine. I really don't understand the huge praise for it. I guess because it has all these stars in it, people really kind of gravitate towards it. And I will say that specifically Leonardo DiCaprio's performance in this movie is really good. I like the scenes where he gets really upset and kind of goes against the sort of meek, quiet character that he's established to be in the first part of the movie. And so when he really descends into that kind of bombastic energy that he can dig up and bring out to the surface, it's really compelling to see. It's a nice contrast to what we saw from before. But other than that, I thought that this movie was kind of just something that we've seen before from different episodes of like TV shows that kind of parody this whole thing. To me, this sort of felt like kind of like a live action big budget Family Guy episode or South Park episode. I guess South Park would be a little more fitting because they're a little more brazen with the way that they satirize things in the media. But for the most part, I thought this movie was just kind of on the nose and really not subtle in the way that it approached the subject matter. Like I said, we just kind of seen this sort of same thing before, so I don't really understand the reason that people are so behind this movie and saying that it's like one of the most important movies that they've ever seen in their entire lives. It's a little hyperbolic for my liking. Obviously Shark Tale starring Will Smith is the superior political commentary movie. But I guess other than my gripes with it, I thought that it was shot in an interesting way. I thought that the performances were good. I thought that for the most part, the humor did kind of land. I guess for me, it landed like 50-50. I'd be curious how I would feel about this movie if I just watched it by myself, because I watched it with a group of people, and the way that people respond in an environment to where other people are laughing at something, you can't help but also feel like something is funny. So if I watched this movie by myself, I'd be very curious to see if I had the same sort of reaction that I did when I watched it the first time. And I'm not saying that this movie is bad in any sense of the word. I just don't think it's as good as people are making it out to be. But hey, that's just my opinion, man. The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou is another Wes Anderson movie. It's an older Wes Anderson movie, came out 2004, I believe, and is about the character played by Bill Murray, who is kind of like a deep sea explorer, who's also like a documentarian. and the sort of ramifications of dealing with an accident and the death of one of his close crewmates, and the grief that he goes through, and the sort of kind of Ahab's Moby Dick tale that he undergoes, where he kind of has to try to get revenge on this fish that killed his friend. To me, this movie, it was like Royal Tenenbaums but with water. That's how I describe this movie. It's it's kind of got the same plot if you think about it. It's just an old guy who's trying to reconcile with some sort of insecurity or missing piece of his life, and he has to try to confront it and fix it in some sort of way, and try to connect with people that he had a hard time connecting with before. Basically Royal Tenenbaums but on water. I think the biggest thing that I like about this movie is the way that it looks. Of course, Wes Anderson, always going to be good visually, but I'm also kind of a sucker for that sort of sea shanty, kind of like blue color scheme, always on the water sort of adventure type of aesthetic. That's why I really like The Lighthouse as a movie. And I thought the performances were good. Like I said when I was talking about French Dispatch, a lot of the characters can kind of feel samey, and that is definitely the case for this movie too. Overall, I think that this movie's good. I think that the situations that the characters find themselves in are a little more interesting than something like Royal Tenenbaums. And I think some of the characters have enough differentiating personalities to kind of set themselves apart from that sort of same writing style that Wes Anderson is known for. But at the same time, most of the other characters just feel like they were written by him. Yeah, it was overall decent movie. I check it out if you like Wes Anderson, I guess. If you like The Water. If you like Bill Murray. Bill Murray's really good in this movie. First Reformed, directed by Paul Schrader, starring Ethan Hawke, is about this guy who's a preacher for this sort of old, almost touristy church that he's a part of, and it kind of deals with the implications of him being confronted by this environmentalist and the different questions he has about God. And so then Ethan Hawke's character starts to kind of second guess what his purpose is and what his place in the world is, and the different ramifications of, I guess, the environment going to shit. I think that the performance from Ethan Hawke is the best part of this movie. I think his character is compelling enough to sort of keep anybody interested in sort of the journey that he's in. Thought that the other performances in this movie were good too. I guess my biggest complaint with this movie is that it was pretty slow paced, and not that I have a problem with slow-paced movies, but I think that this movie was kind of dry in the way that it approached the character and approached the situation, and I think that it could have had a little more going for it to maybe keep me invested in what was happening. I kind of had a hard time trying to care about the character in the situation that he was in, and if I have a hard time connecting with the character that way, then it's going to be harder for me to enjoy a film like this. And there was also some instances where it just kind of felt weird and sort of metaphorical for the sake of being weird and metaphorical, when for the most part this movie is pretty straightforward and straight-laced, and there's not too much room for interpretation, I guess. So those elements just kind of felt like out of nowhere. Overall, decent movie. If you like Ethan Hawke and you like kind of a sort of almost Taxi Driver-esque movie that's a little bit slower and a little bit more methodical, then this movie will be for you. Speaking of characters that I can't connect with and don't really care about, The Green Knight is a movie by David Lowery that stars Dev Patel. Is a fantasy movie about one of King Arthur's knights at the Round Table, who he's not necessarily a knight yet, but he wants to become a knight. And so the Green Knight comes and he poses a challenge to one of the knights, and then Dev Patel's character steps up to the plate, takes a swing, and so the Green Knight tells him that he has a year to go and journey and find the Green Knight and sort of get kind of trade, I guess you could say, without me spoiling any sort of plot in this movie, I guess. I was very much looking forward to this movie. I saw the trailers that came out. It's A24, and I really like the atmosphere that it was building up and the sort of sense of adventure that Dev Patel's character was going to undergo, and I was pretty excited for this movie, and I would be lying if I said I wasn't kind of disappointed with the way that it played out. And first, let me get the positives out of the way. I think that this movie visually is stunning. I think that there are frames of this movie that will stay with me forever, like specifically, and this isn't really a spoiler, but the instance where he's in the lake and there's a skull that he's kind of reaching down and trying to grab. I thought that visually this movie was gorgeous and will absolutely stick with me for a long time. I thought Dev Patel's performance as the character of Sir Gawain was really well done. I thought that he brought a lot of emotion and sort of physicality to the role. A lot of people really enjoy this movie because it's sort of a kind of different sort of medieval tale that not a whole lot of people are used to seeing. It takes a lot of elements from that old story that it's based off of, that really old King Arthur story onto the big screen, and a lot of people really like that. Me personally, the way that it was adapted and the way that it was written, I had a really hard time sort of connecting with the main character and caring about his journey and having any reason why I should care about it. You don't get a whole lot of characterization outside the fact that he just wants to prove himself, and when you have a character like that, it can come across as really kind of one-sided and cocky and a little one-dimensional. And I think that that's a big reason why I had a hard time connecting with this movie and caring about what was happening with him. There were also a lot of scenes that felt really metaphorical, really symbolic, and sometimes those were cool. Sometimes you can gain a lot from just showing that sort of allegorical kind of storytelling, and you can really dig a lot from it. But at the same time, you also run the risk of it feeling pointless, and there were definitely some instances in this movie where it didn't feel like it was going anywhere, that there wasn't really a purpose to everything going on. And I also think that an issue with the movie is the pacing. I think that the pacing is all over the place, and I think that's another problem that I had with the editing as well. There are some scenes that feel like they move at such a brisk breakneck pace, and then there are some scenes that just kind of halt and sort of really step on the brakes and sort of put you in the place that the movie is in and sort of waits there for a while, and you really just kind of want the movie to move on to the next thing. I'm not going to go into too many spoilers, but there's a scene involving this sort of big mansion with a couple other characters that I think is definitely the weakest part of the movie and doesn't really serve any strong purpose to his journey. Overall, I kind of wish this movie was more of the sort of adventure, kind of dark medieval fantasy thing that it was marketing itself as, and I was a little disappointed in some of the purposelessness of the elements of this movie. Who knows, maybe I'll watch it again and the score will change, but for now, 6 out of 10. Candyman, the 1992 version, is directed by Bernard Rose and stars Virginia Madsen as this woman who is trying to figure out what's going on with this urban legend known as the Candyman, where if you say his name, I think 5 times in the mirror or 3 times or something, he appears and you die or something like that. And it's essentially a very well-known kind of gothic horror movie, I guess you could say. I watched this movie because I was visiting my cousin in Ohio, and he'd asked me if I'd seen it before, and I said no, because we were talking about the new Candyman, which I haven't seen. And he was like, "Oh, I got the old one on DVD," and so he popped it in, and so we watched the the old Candyman, which I really didn't have any intention of seeing, but I ended up seeing anyway. And yeah, it was enjoyable. I thought it was good for the most part. There are some scenes in this movie that are just super brutal for being as old as it is. I'm not going to go into spoilers, but there's a scene involving a bathroom and a kid that's just really jarring. And those are some of the things that I appreciate in this movie, sort of the brutality of some of the events and the situations that the characters were in that just kind of set you back and make you go, whoa, this is a whole nother level of movie that I'm watching. But then the movie continues and it sort of becomes a almost typical like urban legend kind of horror movie where like the character has to like make some sacrifices in order to stop the menace that is happening in the movie. And I'm not going to spoil anything, but the way that it plays out, it can kind of come across as cheesy and a little over the top. This movie came out in 1992, but for some reason it feels older than that in some instances. And I think that the way this movie is shot, it's nothing too special. It's just kind of like a typical 90s horror film that if there weren't those elements of like brutality and that sort of mythical figure of the Candyman in it, I think this would be kind of a forgettable horror film. But overall, I thought it was okay. I thought the ending was a little lackluster, a little too cheesy and almost dumb. But I'd say that this is more worth the watch than it isn't. The A-Team is a 2010 action comedy movie that's based off the 1980s television show that's also got the same name, and it stars Liam Neeson, Bradley Cooper, Quentin Jackson, and Sharlto Copley as the A-Team, the team of people who, I mean, you know what the A-Team is. I don't have to explain it. And this movie is essentially about them getting together, becoming the team, and being established as the team, and having to go do missions as the team. I thought this movie was enjoyable purely for like kind of a cheesy kind of level. You know, I thought the acting was okay. I didn't think it was anything too special. This movie was almost forgettable in some kind of way. My friend really enjoys this movie, and it's definitely kind of like on that same level of like it's almost kind of bad but it's good at the same time. And there are some elements in this movie that are just downright bonkers, like the tank scene. Overall, I thought this movie was fine, if anything, just kind of forgettable. The action scenes are just kind of generic and stuff that we've seen in like other not great action movies, I guess you could say, aside from the tank scene, I guess, and some other instances that sort of stand out, but I'm having a hard time recalling right now. So yeah, it's there. Free Guy, directed by Sean Levy, is a Ryan Reynolds movie that he's a video game character, and he finds out that he's in a video game, and he's got to get out of the video game and try to find a way through the video game. This movie is, yeah, it's a Ryan Reynolds movie. It's a comedy movie. Largely, I thought this movie was pretty inoffensive. It's just sort of like this popcorn action comedy flick that's got Ryan Reynolds. I thought that Jodie Comer was pretty good in this. I liked her character in this movie, and I also liked the guy from Stranger Things, Joe Keery, I think is his name. I thought those two characters were interesting. Taika Waititi's in this movie. He's sort of entertaining in some kind of ways. His character's just way over the top and really bombastic. But yeah, it's just kind of like a forgettable Ryan Reynolds action comedy. There's references to other things in this movie. Yeah. Yep. That's pretty much all I have to say. The Matrix Reloaded by the Wachowskis is the second movie in the Matrix series, and Keanu Reeves, Carrie-Anne Moss, Lawrence Fishburne, they all come back, and it continues the story of Neo and the Matrix and the simulation. This movie was kind of really boring for the first, I would say 60% of it, and then when they get back into the Matrix, it really kind of picks up that pace back again. Because really the most interesting part of these movies is the Matrix itself and the world that it's in, and the way that the characters and the action plays out and sort of drives the story forward, the way that it all comes together aesthetically, musically, choreographically, is that a word? And this movie is the best when it is in the Matrix. When it's in the world of Zion, the pacing kind of comes to a halt, and it really bogs the movie down to a snail's pace, I guess you could say. I don't know about you, but I'm not too keen on the whole Zion aspect of it and like the real world machines. I like it when they're in the Matrix, when they're in that interesting world that kind of has that air of mystery to it. And when you take that away and you kind of break it down into what it actually is and explain it and show all of Zion and the people in it and blah, 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 it becomes really jarring, and the tonal shift is just kind of all over the place at that point. That's why I say when the last 40% of this movie gets back into the action of things, it becomes a lot more bearable and a lot more enjoyable to watch. Specifically with the car chase action scene, I thought that was definitely the best part of this movie for sure. But overall, it's kind of a letdown, and it's not as much of a letdown in my opinion as the next one. The Matrix Revolutions is the third Matrix movie, and God, it's yeah, the Wachowskis, they did it. They made that one. And I will say, at least tonally, it matches up with the rest of the movies that came before it, unlike another movie that I will talk about in a bit. But at the same time, you can't help but feel that this is kind of a lukewarm ending to a trilogy that a lot of people just kind of have this fond memory over, when really they're only thinking about the first film and maybe the action scene in the second one. There's some really absurd parts in this movie, like the way that Agent Smith, and I'm not going to get into spoilers too much, but essentially his character in the beginning of the movie is just kind of laughable, and the way that they try to figure him out, it just takes way too long and just almost becomes really funny in a not great way. I guess if I had to praise this movie for something, I did kind of like some of the action scenes in Zion when the machines are attacking, when they're all in like those mech suits and shit's kind of popping off. But again, that's just kind of from a visual standpoint. I thought the characters in those scenes I really couldn't care less about. Really, the only focus that you care about in these movies is Neo and Trinity, Morpheus, like the main three, and like maybe a few other characters, and that's it. They introduce all these other different people in this film, and you're supposed to give a shit about them, and you really kind of don't. There's no real reason for you to care about them other than the fact that they have other people in the movie who care about them. There's no like established history or characterization or anything built up before. It's just kind of this sort of thing that we're told in this movie that we're supposed to care about these people, and I kind of have a hard time doing that when I don't really know who they are. So yeah, Matrix Revolutions. Yeah. Out of Time with Denzel Washington is a 2003 movie directed by Carl Franklin, and is about this guy who's a cop. He's like a sheriff or something in this like small town in Florida, and it's kind of like this romantic sort of mystery thriller movie kind of thing. This movie is so unique. It's not good. It's not a good movie by any stretch of the word, but it's really entertaining because the whole movie is just Denzel Washington in this police station just trying to hide the fact that he had any involvement with a girl who presumably dies in the film, that he like has an affair with, and his name is like on the beneficiary, so like he gets all the money when she dies and blah blah blah. It just becomes this whole like convoluted thing. And it gets even more convoluted because Denzel Washington is doing his best to try to hide his involvement from anything happening in the case. And it's kind of compelling to watch in a way. It's sort of, that's where the fun of this movie comes in, is just watching him sort of scramble around trying to hide the fact that he had anything to do with anything. This is one of those bad movies that I kind of suggest for a bad movie night, because it is so bonkers and convoluted that you can't help but enjoy it, I guess. Thought the acting wasn't great. This is definitely one of Denzel Washington's weakest movies, and Eva Mendes is just kind of laughable, and the other characters are just really, the way they're written is just kind of funny. Also, if you get a chance, look up the poster for this movie. It's so bad. So yeah, Out of Time. It exists. I feel like I have to explain how I came across this. My family and I were vacationing in Virginia, and we were at this like Airbnb cabin that had a DVD player and one DVD, and this movie was that DVD. So I came across this accidentally. I was never going to watch this in any other instance, but it just so happened to find me, and I'm kind of glad that it did. Eternals! It's a MCU Marvel movie that it's a superhero thing, and it's funny enough, this was the first movie that I went to theaters by myself to see. Boy, I wish I saw something else, because this was so boring. It's an MCU movie. It kind of checks all those boxes of like, does it look decent? Is the action okay? Is the set design, does that look all right? And yeah, all that stuff is fine, but I thought that the characters were really dry. You really don't have any reason to care about them other than that they're like a group and they're a family and blah blah blah. I guess the main character in this movie is played by Gemma Chan, and I thought she was probably the most interesting, and I also like Barry Keoghan. I thought he was good. I think he's good in almost everything he's in. But other than those two characters, I really didn't give a shit about anybody else. I really didn't care about the character's journey or anything. It's essentially a big team-up movie that is the opposite of what Guardians of the Galaxy did. Because at least Guardians of the Galaxy sort of showed these characters on their own and depicted them with like these distinct personalities, and the way that the humor rolls off on screen and the way that they interact with each other and sort of are forced to work together, and then, you know, they do kind of get this bond with each other that you care about at the end of the movie. This movie, it's about these characters who have like no personality. They're devoid of anything that resembles an inkling of characterization, and the overall plot isn't really something you care about because you don't care about these characters. You know, you don't give a shit about like who they are or why they're on Earth or whatever. And the way that they try to explain why they weren't involved in all the Thanos stuff and why they didn't try to help stop Thanos is like they keep addressing that fact in the movie, and the more they try to explain it and the more that they set up the world that they come from and why they're created, it just doesn't make any sense. And I'm not going to go into like too many spoilers or whatever, but this movie is definitely one of the most boring MCU movies I've seen, one of the most forgettable MCU movies I've seen, and without a doubt the worst one that I've probably seen. And yes, I've seen Thor: Dark World. At least that had Loki in it. Killing Them Softly, directed by Andrew Dominik, stars Brad Pitt as this kind of hitman character, and he's got to try to find two guys who robbed this sort of back alley gambling game and got away with a bunch of money. And I really didn't like this movie. I know a lot of people enjoy this movie. I think the biggest thing that this film has going for it is the visualization of it. It looks good. I think a lot of cinematography is really unique, especially in the scene where Brad Pitt is in the car and he's shooting at somebody. I think that specific scene is probably the best part of the film. I think Brad Pitt's performance is good, and I think that James Gandolfini is good, but also his character is something that I have a big problem with in this film. And it has more so to do with the way that they wrote the script than the way that he portrayed the character. I think that him being in this movie was wasted potential. I thought for sure that they were setting him up for something that was going to come later in the film, and you really kind of get blue-balled with his character. His character doesn't have any reason to be there. It doesn't really pay to have him show up and then just not have him involved with like the overall scheme of the story. And I get that you maybe want to like show the world that these characters are in and like the different sort of people they interact with, but if it doesn't serve a purpose, then I have a hard time caring about it or seeing the point in any of it. I also thought that some of the writing was pretty weak. Specifically, there's a scene where Ben Mendelsohn and Scoot McNairy are in a car and they're talking about bestiality. Like, what the fuck? That's really fucking weird, and I don't really see the artistic merit of it, I guess, like the point. A lot of the writing in this movie just kind of feels like somebody watched an episode of Breaking Bad, saw two guys talking to each other in a car in like a covert kind of criminal business way and thought to themselves, yeah, I can write a whole movie like that. People like those scenes in Breaking Bad, so I'm going to make those scenes like this in this movie. But the difference between Breaking Bad and this movie is that Breaking Bad kind of has that air of mystery and that build up to it that a TV show allows for. When you just kind of throw it into a movie like this, you don't really care about what's happening with the characters or anything that they're talking about in scenes like that. Sure, it might be compelling from like a performance standpoint, and some of the stuff that they're saying might be interesting, but you don't really have a reason to give a shit. Anyway, I wasn't a huge fan of this movie. A lot of people like this movie, like I said, but it just wasn't for me. I thought it was kind of wasted potential. Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull was directed by Steven Spielberg, written by George Lucas and Jeff Nathanson. Stars Harrison Ford and Shia LaBeouf, and it's the fourth Indiana Jones film. People pretend this doesn't exist, and for good reason. It's fucking bullshit. There's so many scenes in this movie that just don't work in the same way that they do for the movies that came before it. Obviously, Harrison Ford is older in this film. He's a little more, I guess, geriatric, for lack of a better word. And Shia LaBeouf is kind of like this character who tries to like take the reins of Indy and kind of rides his coattails, and you find out who he is as a character later, so he becomes more important, and it's just, yeah, it's something. Of course, there's a lot in this movie that doesn't work. People talk about the kind of supernatural element of things, which I really didn't personally have too much of an issue with in this movie. You know, the movies that came before it had a lot of like religious, superstitious stuff in it, like the Holy Grail and the Ark of the Covenant melting the faces of Nazis off. You know, when it gets into that sort of thing, I have an easier time with it. There's just some things in this movie that just don't translate well, though. Like some of the lines come across as so jilted. Some of the stuff that Harrison Ford says in dialogue just comes across really janky, and some of the visual effects were just not good, have kind of aged poorly, like Shia LaBeouf swinging on vines through the forest with a bunch of monkeys is something that I think should be memed a little bit more. And of course there's the notorious nuclear bomb fridge thing, in which Harrison Ford would most certainly be dead if he flung through the air and landed in the desert in a fridge. At the very least, every bone in his body would be shattered. Overall, I think that this movie could have benefited from not existing, and there's really no purpose or reason to have it. I love the fact that they try to set up Shia LaBeouf as like the next Indy, and then of course he went crazy. The Little Vampire is a kids movie directed by Uli Edel and stars Jonathan Lipnicki. He's the kid from Stuart Little, and is about him being friends with an actual vampire. And then of course people don't believe him, and blah blah blah. Friendship ensues, adventure, and yeah, they have to deal with like a vampire hunter too, and he's like the bad guy in the movie. Really kind of paints these vampires in a positive light for some reason. We watched this movie because we felt like watching a bad movie and like a childhood movie that we could make fun of, and this is a good one to watch. There's a lot of really funny things in this that you can joke about, and I think that's the biggest thing this movie has going for it. Other than that, it's just an inoffensive kind of kids adventure movie that has some like really weird stuff in it that you can point at and laugh at. But yeah, I don't know, it's there. Oh, The Matrix! Here we go. The Matrix Resurrections by Lana Wachowski, not the other Wachowski. They weren't involved in it. It's Lana Wachowski. It stars Keanu Reeves, Carrie-Anne Moss, and is the fourth like long-awaited sequel to The Matrix, and it's bad. It's super bad. Like, okay, let me get the positives out of the way. I love Keanu Reeves, right? It's a big reason why I'm not giving this film like a 2 out of 10. But other than him, and other than like some of the visual stuff in this movie, it was very generic and forgettable and not good. Like, they introduce characters that you don't care about, really. The way that the movie looks visually is so different from the other Matrix films that came before it that it's just kind of jarring to watch, especially when you are coming off of the previous trilogy. And the way that the action is shot in this movie is super generic, and it just kind of looks like any other modern action movie that you'd see. I thought that there were some parts of this movie that were just so bad that it was kind of funny. Like there's a scene where, and this isn't really a spoiler, but there's a scene where characters are like flung out of buildings and they're like trying to hit Neo and Trinity as they're like escaping, and it just comes across as really comical and almost reminded me of something that was like a scene from The Happening by M. Night Shyamalan. Just really goofy and unintentionally hilarious. This movie, of course, was just a disappointment all around, and obviously I wasn't expecting too much from it, but it kind of is getting a weird amount of praise for the meta aspect of the first like 30% of the film, and I get that it is getting praise for that, but at the same time, when you're introducing that element of being meta and then the movie continues and you don't really address it anymore, it's just purposeless and it doesn't serve a point in anything. So you just were meta for the sake of being meta. Like, oh look, they're acknowledging the last movies in the movie, and they name dropped Warner Brothers, how they want them to do a sequel, and isn't that super cool? And it blows your mind, bro. Like, yeah, that's cool, but what's the point? Anyway, I'm done talking about this movie. Moving on. Venom is directed by Andy Serkis. Talking, of course, about Venom Let There Be Carnage, not the first one. And has Tom Hardy, Michelle Williams, and Woody Harrelson as Cletus Cassidy. And is the sequel to the other Venom movie that came out in 2018, and it's just a movie where Tom Hardy is Venom, and he's a big thing of goop, and he's got to fight another big thing of goop, and yeah, it's good rip-roaring CGI PG-13 time. Of course, this movie's not good. Nobody was expecting it to be good, but I went and saw it in theaters because I heard something about the end credits that was very interesting, and I'm not going to spoil it, but it really wasn't worth it. I guess the biggest thing in this film, I guess you could say, is that Tom Hardy gives it his all. He's really, I think, kind of into the character of Eddie Brock and Venom, and he is really embracing that kind of culture around him being the character and how fans like him as the character. And I can tell that he gives a shit, which I guess is the biggest thing you can say about this movie. But overall, this movie being PG-13, it really doesn't serve the character of Venom any justice. You know, he's kind of connotated with being this violent, over-the-top, really kind of monstrous character that rips people apart and like eats their heads and bites their heads off and that sort of thing. And when the movie's PG-13, it kind of does it a disservice, and you don't really get to see the character how he was written in the comics or was meant to be portrayed. I think it's one of those few cases where an R rating would kind of benefit this type of movie, because then at least it could really embrace that sort of campy, violent nature of it that it doesn't really get to with the rating that it gets. I think that some of the moments in this movie are just really goofy and sort of come across as just too tongue-in-cheek for me, I guess you could say, which is weird for a Venom movie for me to say, but nevertheless, that's something that I kind of had a gripe with. I think I liked the first movie a little bit better because it had a nice balance of that sort of characterization, that struggle that Eddie Brock has, and also the goofiness of the Venom symbiote and the sort of monstrous implications that has, and also the funny implications that has. This movie leans, I think, way too much into like the humor of it, and a lot of it just doesn't land. Like, oh look, Venom is off on his own and he's at like this party and people think he's in costume and he's wearing these like flower necklaces and people love him and he's in a rave, woohoo, rave Venom, and it doesn't translate well, I don't think. And this movie was pretty forgettable. Woody Harrelson is just he's kind of funny in a not good way. Like the way that he portrays this villain and the way that he's written is kind of bad. He's, I think, trying just way too hard to be like this edgy kind of anti-Venom villain character, and it doesn't work. I'll just say that. So yeah, that's Venom. Gotta go get him. Ain't gonna. The Tomorrow War by Chris McKay, starring Chris Pratt, is a sci-fi movie where Chris Pratt has to go in the future and fight some aliens. I fucking hated this movie. This movie was just bullshit. I couldn't stand it, man. So this movie is just Chris Pratt fighting these aliens because his whole character is that he cares about his family and he wants his family to live and to see another day, and he wants to make a good future for his daughter, and his character is that he loves his daughter so much. Oh my god, he loves his daughter. I thought some of the CGI in this movie looked okay. Like some of the alien design and the way that it was shot, specifically in like a night vision way in some points of the movie, was kind of effective. But after that, they just kind of look like this generic like dog like alien monster. What I thought the movie was going to be was I thought they were going to be fighting aliens that were sentient and could communicate and sort of had this intelligence about them, when essentially the aliens in this movie are just big monstrous dogs. And when you make them like that, then they're not really interesting in any way, and they just kind of become this generic monster that they have to fight. You know, it wouldn't be any different if it were aliens in this movie versus like a zombie infection. You know, you could have the same exact plot with zombies as you do aliens this movie, and it wouldn't make a damn difference. The fact that they're aliens is just a backseat element of this whole film. There are some moments in this movie that are just so laughably bad, like the slow motion Chris Pratt leaning in to like save somebody that he sees falling into like this pit of water that is infected by like the aliens or whatever. Like it's come across as like this attempt at like a Renaissance painting sort of thing, but it just looks so stupid. And the way that the scene plays out and the way the plot is so brain dead and needlessly convoluted in some parts. And there are some things that just don't make any sense. Like they're target practicing for the aliens before they get shipped off into the future, but the targets that they're shooting at are like human shaped, which doesn't serve any sort of benefit for the people going into the future because the aliens aren't human at all. They don't look like it. They're totally different shaped, totally different size to what the cardboard cutout targets are that they're shooting at. So it really doesn't serve any purpose at all. And then they try to explain like, oh, we can't tell you what the aliens look like because you won't be able to like comprehend them, and nobody would want to be a part of this in the first place. Nobody would be going. And it's like, you guys are forcing people to go anyway. Like, why not just tell them what they look like? They're gonna go to the future no matter what. They're kind of forced into this sort of mission. They try to touch on different subjects in a way that they think is interesting, but it just comes across as them talking about it for like a second and then they just abandon it. Like the notion of the draft and being forced to fight in a war or in combat that you don't care about or that you don't see for yourself, and the notion that society's elderly becomes, I guess, more useless in the eyes of young people, which is kind of like inversed in this movie because they essentially take older dying people and send them into the future because they know they're going to die soon anyway. Like, those are interesting subjects to cover, but when you just introduce them and don't do anything with them and just abandon them in the minute that you bring it up, it just doesn't work. Like, we get you're trying to be smart and commentating on this sort of subject, but you're not being smart because you just abandon it. Yeah, overall, dumb movie. I'd skip it. Yeah. Watch Guardians of the Galaxy instead. Much better Chris Pratt movie. Red Notice was a piece of shit that was directed by Rawson Marshall Thurber and stars Dwayne Johnson, Ryan Reynolds, and Gal Gadot as like these agents, spy, thieves, kind of, and they're all like fighting to get these like precious artifacts or what. I don't really know. I don't really remember. I don't really care. This movie sucks. Dwayne Johnson's playing himself. Ryan Reynolds playing himself. Gal Gadot is playing somebody who's a bad actress. This is like the highest viewed Netflix movie ever, and that just makes me weep. That makes me weep for humanity. And I'm not gonna harp on people for liking what they like. You know, they have a right to enjoy garbage, but it's just something that I have to point out. The action in this movie is not anything special at all. It's something that we've seen done a million times better in 100 different movies that came before it. Really, I think what people like about this movie is The Rock and Ryan Reynolds just kind of having a weird back and forth with each other. But yeah, they're playing themselves and they're being snarky. And some of the jokes in this movie are so bad. Like, one of the jokes in this movie that comes up twice, by the way, is Ryan Reynolds making fun of somebody's Instagram account. That's not a joke. You just brought up Instagram. That's not a funny. It's not a funny line. There's nothing clever about it. Like, damn, fuck me. I'm done talking about this movie. Next is a 2007 science fiction movie with Nicolas Cage and is directed by Lee Tamahori. This movie pissed me off. Aladdin 2019, directed by Guy Ritchie, is a remake of the animated Disney movie that it's based on. And you got Blue Will Smith, and you've got Jafar, and he sucks. You've got the parrot. He's a parrot. He's not a character. He's just a parrot. This movie was just awful. And the way that I have to explain how it's awful is kind of varied, because visually this movie just looks like a giant set piece, right? It's not a believable set in any way. It looks like it's shot like a soap opera, made for TV movie thing that you would see at like 8 o'clock on ABC Family. It's visually just so lackluster. I thought the acting was horrific too. Will Smith is actually not the worst part as far as acting goes, but still he looks pretty dumb in this movie. And I thought Jafar's actor was probably the worst part. He's just so one-dimensional and stupid, and you don't feel any sense of evil or menace. You're not scared of him as a villain or a character like you might have been from the animated movie. You know, there's nothing distinguishing about him. He's just sort of like this blank slate of a man who is trying to get into power, and that's it. This movie's fucking dumb. Watch the OG. At least you get Robin Williams. Oldboy 2013 by Spike Lee is an American remake of the 2003 Korean action revenge film that stars Josh Brolin as Joe Doucette and Joe Doucette, Odesu. Get it? It's rearranged. This movie is a bastardization of the 2003 movie in every sense of the word. The changes that they make in this movie don't make any sense. The changes are there just to kind of be a little edgier than what the first movie went for. Oh, he's in captivity for 15 years. We're going to make this 20 years. I can't really go into any more without spoiling it, so I won't. But essentially, this movie takes creative liberties that just don't make any sense at all. It really kind of loses that sense of what the original movie was going for. And as a result, it just comes across as very disingenuous, very cheesy, just a poorly done sort of version of what the first movie already accomplished and already did great. What's sad is that this movie in America is more widely available than the Korean version of Oldboy. So a lot of people are going to hear about Oldboy as a movie, the original one probably, and they're going to look for it and they're going to go, well, I can't get access to the Korean version, but there's the American version and it's got to be just as good, right? It's essentially the same story. And I'm here to tell you to not do that, because I watched this movie right after pretty much I watched the original one, and don't do it. Don't do it. Find a way to get the other Oldboy. Get a VPN, find it online somewhere, and order like a DVD on Amazon. Something. Anything to avoid watching this Oldboy. There's also some stuff going on with like the posters and the promotional stuff for this movie that was really shady on the producers and Spike Lee's part, which I'm not going to get into, but just a whole nother reason to kind of shit on this movie deservingly, I guess. So yeah, Oldboy 2013, Joe Doucette. More like Joe Do Set This Movie Away and Light It on Fire. Dune 1984 by David Lynch is of course the story of Paul Atreides. Is like a sci-fi story. I already talked about this when I talked about the 2021 Dune. It's essentially the same plot, except it tries to squeeze the whole book into one movie and it just doesn't work. Visually, the movie is so corny looking and the special effects are so bad that it just takes you out of everything that you're watching. The writing and the way that the characters are portrayed are so goofy. It's either one extreme or the other. Characters are either too wooden and they don't have enough of a personality, or they're way too bombastic and goofy and they come across in such a disingenuous way that is just so jarring. Overall, the pacing of this movie is way too quick. It tries to squeeze in the whole first book, like I said, in a breakneck plot pace, and you can tell that putting this movie together, David Lynch probably just had a hell of a time just trying to finish this movie and get it done with and not wanting to have anything to do with it anymore. What's really funny is that this is the only David Lynch movie I've ever seen up to this point. So yeah, you could say that I'm a film buff, I guess. I've watched Lynch before. Oh, the 1 out of 10. Gentlemen Broncos is a piece of shit fuck-ass movie that was directed by Jared Hess and stars Michael Angarano and Jermaine Clement from Flight of the Conchords. And this movie is essentially a comedy movie about this kid who's a writer, and he writes this science fiction story, and he goes to this writers convention, and he can submit his story to a contest to where this famous author will pick the best one that he reads out of all the entries, and he'll draw like an illustration for that person's book when they eventually publish it. And then the author, who's played by Jermaine, gets a hold of this story, and he kind of creates it as his own and passes it off as his own. And so the story is about this guy's writing who gets stolen from him, and the story just kind of gets out of his hands and doesn't become his own story anymore. Essentially, this is a movie that has such a good premise. It's got such a good concept for a story and a plot, and it falls completely flat on its face. Of course, Jared Hess is the same guy who did Napoleon Dynamite. I love Napoleon Dynamite. I haven't seen Nacho Libre. Essentially, this movie is kind of an inverse of Napoleon in that the way that the characters were portrayed in that movie was each of the main ones were kind of quirky and slightly weird in their own way, and they were reacting to an environment around them that was normal and kind of mundane, and that's where a lot of the humor came from. Whereas this movie, the main character is the most normal character out of everyone in this movie, and everyone else around him is so either gross or rude or weird or just off for some reason or another. And that's where like the quote unquote funny comes from. But this movie's not funny. That's the biggest issue that this movie has. It's not funny at all. It's just disgusting. It's gross. There are scenes in this movie that just are gross for the sake of trying to make you laugh, and it just makes you uncomfortable. And it's such a piece of shit. I hated the character of, what the fuck was his name? Lonnie? I hated the character of Lonnie in this movie. I thought he was one of the worst characters I've ever seen in the movie. I hated the way that he was portrayed. I hate his character. I hate his personality. I just wanted to suffocate him. Almost everybody in this movie was just abhorrent and trashy and bad. And I'm not talking about the actor portrayals in it. I'm talking about the characters, of course. You know, obviously the actors are just doing their job and following the way the script was written, but the script was just terrible. I've never seen a movie like this to where there is such a good concept in there somewhere, but they just do everything they can to make the movie not enjoyable to sit through. So many characters are there just for the sake of being weird and disgusting and gross, and it just, I laughed once at this movie on purpose, and it was the scene where he's on the bus and he like lightly smacks his pillow accidentally in some girl's face. That was like the funniest this movie ever got for me, and it was just like this accidental piece of comedy that they included just randomly, and it mostly because it threw me off guard. Fuck this film. Scary Movie 3 by David Zucker is a spoof movie about scary movies. It is the third movie in the Scary Movie series. My friends wanted to watch this when we were at like this Airbnb thing, and they enjoy it. There's some parts in this that they find really funny. I laughed, I think, once, and it was when a character got flung out a window because I didn't expect it. Like I said in Gentlemen Broncos, when the girl gets hit in the face with a pillow, it just kind of caught me off guard. Otherwise, I just sat and I watched this movie eating grapes, and yeah, I lost like 2 hours. I lost 2 hours watching that movie, and it's something that I think about sometimes. And you know when you're lying in bed and you can't fall asleep and you're on the verge of falling asleep, but then you remember something really cringy that you did, and it keeps you up for like another 2 hours, and you have to go into work the next day and you have to wake up at 4, and you're just so tired and beaten down and you have no energy, and everyone around you just sounds slightly more annoying than they usually do. That's a better experience than watching this movie. Gemini Man. Oh, directed by Ang Lee and stars Will Smith and Will Smith. Listen, we've talked about this movie on the podcast. We've talked about it in our third episode, and there's not much more I can say about this film that I haven't said before in that episode, but I'm going to do my best to keep it fresh and keep it unique as to why this movie is one of the worst ones that I saw. Essentially, the CGI is so dank sometimes, like it just doesn't look good. It's not believable. Young Will Smith, when you see him, you just know that it's not young Will Smith. It's just old Will Smith with a bunch of CGI. There are some plot points, and they suck. Fun fact, this movie was written by David Benioff, who is one of the showrunners for Game of Thrones that tanked the last season. So yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. This was one of those movies that was in development hell since like 1997, and there were a myriad of reasons why it never got made until 2019. They had different like screenwriters, different directors. There were going to be different people attached to star in this movie. At one point, they had Harrison Ford and Mel Gibson in talks to be the lead role in this movie, and of course that didn't work out. They got my boy Will. The plot and the script and the way that this movie is written is just not as convoluted as you'd think it'd be, but it's just dumb, and it's something that's so generic and that we've seen before in so many other better movies that have done it well, that it just becomes old really fast. I thought a lot of the characterizations in this movie didn't make sense, specifically with young Will Smith. I thought that his motivations were all over the place. The plot with the bee venom and the mention of that like horrible foreshadowing with that and how he's allergic to bee venom and the way that it's implemented later in the movie is just, it's like they drop the ball so hard with that, and it just comes across as so disingenuous. There's so many tonal shifts in this movie that you don't really get the sense of like what they're actually going for any long period of time in this movie. Some scenes it's an action movie, some scenes it's a drama. At the end of the movie, it becomes like this lighthearted family comedy for some damn reason. At certain points, it's like this sort of sci-fi, heavy implication, high concept thriller that just doesn't translate well. This movie is really unconvincing. It's very just generic and boring. That's the biggest thing that this movie has going against it, is it's so boring. It's so damn boring. And you think with a movie that has two Will Smiths in it fighting each other, it wouldn't be as much of a snooze fest. But I think I've said all that I need to say about this. Like I said before, we talk about it in episode 3 of our podcast. So if you really want an in-depth view of what we thought of this travesty, then check that episode out. Real quick, I also want to mention a couple TV shows that I watched. So I watched Invincible towards the beginning of that year, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really well done animated show that's geared more towards adult audiences. Obviously, it's based off of a comic book that was written by Robert Kirkman, who, if you don't know, he is responsible for all the Walking Dead comics. And so he's been at this for quite a while. I thought that the decision to make it animated was a good decision because you can really not have any limits as to what you can portray in the show and the things that you can do with the characters and the situations. If I had one complaint about the show, it'd be about the character of Amber. I had a pretty big problem with some of the instances of her writing and the way that they portray her character. I didn't think it was coming across the way that they intended, and hopefully that's something that they maybe address in season 2. But overall, I thought this television show was entertaining, and I'm really looking forward to watching more of it. They confirmed seasons 2 and 3, so hopefully those will come out soon. I also watched Squid Game on Netflix. Is a South Korean TV show that's kind of like set in this modern sort of dystopian environment where people are kidnapped and forced to participate in these deadly games that they can't really leave from, and the winner gets like this big cash prize. I thought that this show was really entertaining and really gripping. I watched it pretty much in a 3-day span during like a trip down south to see some family in North Carolina, and then I watched it again with my parents because I convinced them to give it a chance despite their gripes with the fact that it was something that they would have to read with subtitles. But overall, they really enjoyed it, and I'm happy with the fact that they embraced a piece of media that's from another country. I think that if I had any complaints about this, is that I think the last half isn't as good as the first half, but overall, I think it's cohesive enough to where it all connects together and builds towards something that is really effective and makes you look forward to if they ever make any more of it. So yeah, 9 out of 10. Well, guys, we did it. We reached the end of the list. We've gone from the best movies to the worst movies from top to bottom, and we've reached the 9th circle of hell. So hopefully I'm able to climb my way out, but thank you anyway for listening to this and for watching this video. I hope it's something that you enjoyed. I hope to make maybe a few more videos like this year, and of course next year I plan on doing the same sort of thing. I don't know if I'll watch as much movies as I did this past year, because going through these has been kind of a long process, and if I ever do, if I do end up doing this again with the same amount or more movies, hopefully it'll be a little more streamlined and a little quicker in the way that I talk about each one than this year's was, because this ended up being quite the long video. But nonetheless, it was a lot of fun to make, and hopefully you get some enjoyment out of my opinions for each of these. If you agree with my viewpoints, that's great. If you don't agree with some of the movies that I talk about from my opinion, then definitely let me know. And I will do my best to care about it. I'm just kidding. Yeah, definitely let me know what you think of this. Hopefully it's something you enjoy, and hopefully I get to make more. So, yeah. Bye-bye.